Okay, the recording's starting and I'll start the stream for Facebook. I'll just take a moment. Sorry, the integration with Facebook is sometimes a little sluggish with Zoom. There we are.
Okay.
We're all set.
All right. Pursuant to recently adopted amendments to the Illinois Open Meetings Act, included in Public Act 101-0640, public bodies may, in certain circumstances, hold entirely virtual public meetings without a quorum physically present in any one location. On March 11th, 2020, Village President Levin issued a declaration of emergency pursuant to the authority granted by the Village Code, the Illinois Municipal Code, and the Illinois Emergency Management Agency Act to address the health threat posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. On July 15th, 2020, President Levin executed a written determination that given the ongoing emergency associated with the COVID-19 pandemic, in-person meetings of the Board of Trustees are not practical or prudent at this time and until further notice. On June 26, 2020, Governor Pritzker issued a new disaster proclamation and Executive Order 2020-43 that declared in-person attendance at public meetings of more than 50 people at the regular public meeting location to be infeasible in accordance with the Open Meetings Act, as amended by Public Act 101-0640. Governor Pritzker reissued this declaration on September 18, 2020 through a renewed disaster proclamation and Executive Order 2020-55. In accordance with the Governor's renewed disaster proclamation, President Levin's declaration of emergency, and President Levin's recent determination regarding meetings of the Village Board of Trustees, in-person meetings of the Finance Committee are not practical or prudent at this time and until further notice. Accordingly, this meeting of the Finance Committee is being conducted virtually with members participating through the Zoom webinar platform. Village Manager Phil Corrali is in Village Hall conference room as required by the Open Meetings Act. Can we have roll call, please?
Certainly. Trustee Vree.
Here.
Trustee Miller. Trustee Rubin.
Here.
We have a quorum.
To help facilitate this meeting, I ask each member of the board and staff to mute your lines if you are not speaking and unmute your line when you speak to help minimize background noise. Members of the public are muted and should remain muted during the meeting. As required by law, I will ask for a roll call rather than voice votes on any agenda item requiring a vote. In accordance with the supplemental rule the board approved on April 16th, 2020, here's how public comment will be taken at this meeting. The email address and telephone number designated for public comment for this meeting were published with the meeting agenda. This time I will ask Management Analyst, Deputy Village Clerk Jordan Lester to read the public comments that were submitted prior to the meeting in compliance with the instructions that were previously published with the meeting materials.
Trustee Vree, we did not receive any public comment prior to tonight's meeting.
If a member of the public would like to submit a public comment during the meeting, please email your comment to glencoemeeting@villageofglencoe.org. Comments submitted during the meeting may be read at the end of the meeting. Written comments should be limited to 400 words. All right. Okay, I think I'm done reading. It's going for record time, I don't think.
You did great.
Okay, can we have, looking for a motion to approve the minutes? Any?
He's looking at you, Gary.
Motion.
Action, I may wind up getting disconnected and reconnecting.
All right, well, I second if you made one.
Okay.
I motion to, yes, further the motion, etc.
Can I make a motion as?
You can,
Oh,
yes.
okay.
In this circumstance, yep, you're a voting member. So we've got trustee Rubin as the mover, trustee Vree as the seconder. We'll do a roll call. Trustee Vree,
Yes.
trustee Rubin. I heard a sigh, which we'll take as a yes.
Yes.
There we go.
All right. Nikki, can you move on to the monthly financial reports?
Okay, thank you. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, just a quick note on tonight's agenda. So we will, as Trustee Bree just stated, start with the September Treasurer's Report. I will be going through the Treasurer's Report rather quickly this evening, understanding that we have a massive agenda. Moving on from there, we will also call upon Stella to give a brief golf club highlight reel. And then we will move into the stub year community investment program update, the tax levy estimate, and then finally into the draft budget. So included in your packet for this evening was the September Treasurer's Report. Just going on high level in the general fund, we are seeing the continuation of existing trends that we have discussed in previous months. Property taxes still remain lower than prior year. We do believe that quite a few folks took advantage of the extended deadline with the county, so October will be a telling number for that, but right now we're at 91.7% of budget. We are seeing continued levels of sales taxes that are lower than prior year, but as we'll talk about in a moment, those appear to be rebounding quite a bit. Permit revenue is still lower than prior year. It's at 50% of budget right now, and we are projecting it to end the year well below budget as well. The water fund continues to perform strong. As indicated in your packet in the report, we did have to estimate the September water bills because of a few hiccups that we encountered with our water billing system, our brand new water billing system. However, when looking at the pumpage reports for the year to date, we are significantly higher than last year. So we do expect that this is a relatively solid estimate and that this fund will continue to perform strong throughout the rest of the year. A few highlights in the cash flow projections of the report. As I noted earlier, sales taxes appear to be rebounding quite a bit. You can see here in the month of July with April sales was really kind of our bottom out related to the COVID pandemic. And then it starts to rebound. And actually for the month of October, which was actually July sales, our monthly receipt was actually higher than this month last year. So this is something we'll continue to monitor as we move later into the year. We'll talk a little bit about where these budget projections are at, but we are still expecting this to be a relatively lowered level as compared to prior years. Ultimately, it will depend on how we fare the cold and flu season later this year. Personal property tax, as we've discussed previously, this is down quite a bit. This month is about 48% less than this month last year, and it's lower than budget. We do expect to see declines as much as 28% in this revenue as a result of the state of Illinois' budget changes. Parking fees, no one's surprise, remain at record lows. And we expect that to continue for the remainder of the year. And all of these things combined come up to a projected loss estimate of just under $700,000 for the year. So this compares, last month, we had about a $642,000 projection, so we're still in that same ballpark, but unfortunately, that number has grown a little bit. So again, that's something we will update every month as we see these trends evolve. And at this point, I'm happy to answer any questions on the Treasurer's Report. Okay, seeing none, I will pass it on to Stella so she can give a golf club update.
Just very quickly, September continued a great demand for golf, weather having a huge role in it, as well as other factors. Rounds year to date were 5,500 over budget. Just to give you an idea how much weather plays into it, we're 8,000 rounds over where we were last year. So a huge swing for a lot of different reasons. Electric cart rental is way up because we've had a dry season. So we're at 300,000 in cart rentals, which is way above where we've ever been for a full season. High schools were able to play in September. We're the home of Loyola Academy girls team. We also had North Shore Country Day and New Trier, their booster club, utilized the course. So we're full utilization for all the high schools. And just briefly, the fundraising is going along very well. We have recruited one new board member, and we're still looking for new board members, and we're in the middle of our external interviews with Campbell and Company, conducting those. And we're going to have, when they're all done, 15 interviews conducted that's going to test our campaign piece moving forward. That's my report. Questions?
Just
No.
one quick question. With all the extra rounds, how much do we think will sort of net to the positive?
We'll see how it shakes out at the end of the year. Right now, our revenues are over budget by about 200,000.
Great, thanks.
It's great.
Moving on to CIP, I don't know if, Nikki, if you were doing, okay. Okay, take us through it.
Okay, good evening. There isn't much to update on the CIP. There is a change order that you'll be asked to consider at Thursday evening's village board meeting. This is a contract with Schroeder and Schroeder for some storm sewer drainage improvements at Vernon Avenue in the amount not to exceed $35,000. At this time, I do want to turn this over to Public Works Director Dave Mao to provide the committee an update on the Skokie Lagoon.
Yes, good evening. As you're well aware, staff has been dealing with a leak on the village's 16-inch water transmission main. That's the 3,000-foot pipe that extends from essentially the intersection of Elder Court and the elevated tank out on the frontage road. In mid-August, a leak was appeared on that line. Not the first time we've had that happen. And through extensive exploratory work, survey work, staff has determined that the best course of action is to replace a 1,000-foot section of that main. That'll involve directional boring a new pipe under Forestway Drive under the east diversion ditch and tying back into existing. That work requires permits from both IEPA for the water main and IDOT for work under Forestway Drive. Those permits have been submitted, and we're working on an expedited review on those. Preliminary timetable would be to hopefully secure permits by the end of the month and complete this repair work before the end of November. Given the expedited timetable, staff will bring this back and looking to add this emergency work as a change order to the 2020 water main replacement contract. Preliminary cost estimate at this point for this work is in the range of $175,000 to $200,000.
One item to note relative to that, and Finance Director Larson can probably speak better to this, is that we do believe there are resources available through the recent bond sale in the water fund, as well as fund balance to accommodate this unexpected cost. But just to also add to Director Mao's comments, we are likely to bring back a confirming resolution in November to the village board, just given the timing of this, we'll keep you in the loop as we solidify those costs to this, but that this would likely need to proceed prior to our next round of village board meetings.
Thank you, Manager Corrali. Just to add to that, I mean, you did a nice job of summarizing that, but as the committee may recall, when we issued alternate revenue bonds earlier this year, we did receive a premium on those bonds, and that paired with the favorable bid that we received on the water meter replacement program would allow us to utilize excess bond reserves or bond proceeds to fund this project. That does mean that we can't do as much water main as we had originally planned next year. So that'll be something that we'll talk about in terms of the budget, but in terms of the emergency repair now, we do have the resources to fund that.
I don't have any questions. Gary, I'm not sure if you're having.
No, unfortunately, I think I understand it really well. It's just another example of why that water tower is in a really bad location for us.
Yep. Okay, moving on.
Okay, the next item on the agenda is the property tax levy estimate for tax year 2020. As you all probably know, the tax year of 2020 is collectible in 2021, so this would be impacting the budget that we're going to discuss this evening. As you may recall from last year, every year the village must present an estimate of the property tax levy on a public agenda and establish a public hearing to discuss the levy. Last year and in years prior, we typically do the hearing and the adoption of the property tax ordinance in the same month. This year we've backed that up both because we have a calendar year end and also to allow a little bit more time for public feedback. So we are recommending a hearing date of next month. That would be at the village board meeting on November 19th, 2020. If the committee is in favor of proceeding with that date, following this meeting, staff would publish the date of the hearing in the newspaper and on the village's website so that folks are aware that we will be discussing this. The Department of Revenue is allowing a maximum increase in the levy of 2.3% over last year's property tax extension. As you may recall from last month's discussion on financial policies, the village has had a policy of establishing its property tax levy in accordance with this percentage increase since 1994. So the estimate included in your packet this evening represents just over a 2.3% increase in each of the levy lines, the public library and the village extensions. This is slightly higher than the 2.3% because we are allowed an estimate for new growth in town. So this would be anything that would include remodeling, new construction. So in some cases, we are able to levy slightly higher than the limit. So that would be the extension there. And ultimately, the county will decide the appropriate increase once our EAV numbers are finalized. So the total levy as presented, including debt service and the public library, is just over $15 million. It's a $271,000 increase. And when you net that out with the debt service fund, because we did the refinancing and we do have some variation in our payment schedules, the overall increase is actually only 1.8% over last year's extension. And included in the packet, oh,
sorry.
Please go ahead.
How much, sorry to interrupt, but how much new growth for next year does that anticipate, or does that include assuming that there is as much new growth as we put in the number?
We use an average, a historical average for our our growth, and actually included on this detail slide, that's a perfect transition. Your question is a perfect transition. You can see here by line, we allocate out exactly how much new growth we're expecting. So we have about just shy of 65,000 in new growth expected. And that's
I'm
based
sorry,
off-
I apologize for interrupting again.
Nope, that's okay.
I'm asking a different question, I think. I'm asking, as an existing taxpayer, I don't do anything to my house. My tax bill shouldn't go up more than 2.3% in general, if that's what PTEL tells us, right?
Correct.
Assuming all other factors didn't change and everybody's allocations of value stayed the same and all that. So on a gross basis, our taxpayers' bills can't go up more than 2.3. They're actually going to go up a little less than that because we saved them some money, saved us some money, all of us, because of our financing.
Correct.
I'm asking new homes, new this, new that, Hoover Estate, et cetera. What's the gross EAV that we throw in the number and say, but for that, here's some extra that we didn't have before that's not subject to the PTEL.
Just a moment. Let me pull that up.
And I know you're going to go through all this in a more detailed
Yep.
fashion in the hearing,
No
but
problem. So the estimate that we're projecting is about $6 million. So that would be values of permits. That's new construction, that's remodel, all
okay.
in.
Isn't given, well, just given the permits and what's happening in the village, and I'm just wondering, is that high enough?
Is it high enough?
In other words, do you think more than $6 million of new homes are going up?
That's about, well, it's about the average since 2011. Last year, our growth was 5.6 million. So we do have a little bit of an escalator in there. We have seen a little bit of a trail off in permit activity. So any new growth that the county would be including for us next year would be based off of permit data that we're giving them this year. So I would anticipate us seeing a larger growth, assuming that the village board proceeds with the Hoover Estate redevelopment agreement on Thursday night. Once that construction starts, I believe this number would be escalated quite a bit.
Okay, and since we just don't know the timing of that, that's why I'm wondering.
Correct.
So you're saying for this tax year payable next year, as opposed to the following year, the number might jump quite a bit. That's what I was
Correct.
wondering about, is whether or not our number, I'm just actually surprised it's only $6 million for this year, given all the new construction I see in town, but so be it. Okay, thank you.
No problem. Great question. Are there any other questions on the property tax levy estimate? Generally, are we okay with a November hearing date?
Just one question. As I look at what you put up there and what I recall from looking at this as we've been building it, if you were a taxpayer, you would probably see about a 1.9% increase in your tax bill. Is that correct?
That's
Based
fair
on-
to say. I would say about 2%, no more than 2.3. Kind of what Gary was saying. Yeah,
Yep. Thank you.
no problem. Any other questions? Okay. All right. I think
Main event.
Chair Vree, are you
Oh,
ready
okay,
to
sorry.
move on to budget?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Well, I didn't, sorry.
All right. No, that's the problem.
Oh,
The
one
moment
other-
you've all been waiting for. Oh,
Sorry, one other quick question about the tax levy.
Yes.
What's the date to certify, or I assume it's obviously after November 19th. How late do we have to certify our number to the folks at Cook County?
it's usually the last Tuesday in December.
Okay.
So what we would plan for would be a property tax levy hearing in November, and then the presentation of the ordinance for the board's approval at our December meeting, and then we would file right after that. Okay, perfect. All
Okay.
right,
All right, shall we move on to budget?
ready to go. So I am going to turn it over to Manager Corrali to introduce the budget.
So thank you, Nikki, and good evening, everybody. This is the moment we've all been waiting for, is the sit down to really begin to unpackage the draft budget as staff has developed it. We'll go through what we have developed, and each of the departments will briefly overview their recommendations, and then we'll also circle back through and talk probably to some degree for some significant amount of time on the CIP and potential financing options for that. Before we get into the specifics, and Nikki, if you can advance the slide, that'd be great. The first thing I just wanted to touch on, and then you have the great good fortune of not having to listen to me again for a while, is to just kind of set the stage of what the calendar year 2021 budget entails. Many of these points are points that we have been talking about really since the beginning of the stub year 20 budget, but they bear some value in repeating as we kind of set the stage for our discussion this evening. So what are those major factors that are driving the budget? One of them, and this is a fairly structural factor, is the fact that we're moving again from a 10-month budget that we are living in right now, our stub year, back to a 12-month budget cycle. That by itself has added some complexity in comparisons to the current year as well as past years. We are kind of restructuring our entire schedule, and with that does come some complexity in budgetary comparisons. But we'll be walking you through some of that this evening. Obviously, a major part of our conversations in all of the finance committees going back to March have been impacts relative to the COVID-19 pandemic. As we talked about over the last few months in terms of developing our financial forecast and looking at our financial policies, we are in the midst of probably one of the more complex revenue projection schemes that we've ever been in. Trying to anticipate what next year might entail. I've said this to a few of the trustees. In some ways, the difficulty with this is we just don't have solid data to look back to understand what we might be looking forward to. So we have the information that we've been developing during the course of this year, some of which we talked about earlier this evening, relative to how the pandemic is impacting our revenue streams. And this will be discussed in more detail. Our initial estimates as we've worked into this budget is that almost $800,000 in reduced revenue overall throughout the budget is being impacted by the continuation of the pandemic. Our hope is that as we move into 2021, that number may not hold true and that it in fact improves. However, we want to, from the standpoint of conservative budgeting, be very mindful that this is an unpredictable time. Along with that, there are some other revenue impacts. Certainly, as we were just discussing, some modest proposed increases to the property tax. Our water and sewer rates have been on a schedule over the last several years to increase, tied back into reinvestment into those structural systems. And there are some other fees that are relatively minor in the grand scheme of the budget that we'll talk about in a few minutes as well. The operating budget impacts was something that this year we've probably taken a more exacting look at than we have in the past, understanding that our financial is so difficult to predict. There were some significant efforts undertaken by staff, which you'll hear about in a little while, to work to reduce our overall budget expenditure requests That has included some significant changes in our overall staffing structure for next year. You may recall there are 4 current positions that are being held vacant in the organization, 2 in the Public Works Department, 1 in the Village Manager's Office, and 1 in the Public Safety Department. We are proposing in this budget to reduce by 1 the total number of full-time employees in the general fund, and then to delay hires on 2 of those remaining positions, and then to move forward with refilling 1 of those positions after January 1st. The delays would not take place until after July 1. We also have an unusual structure when it comes to how we're looking at cost of living adjustments for our work group. Just as a reminder, of the village's just over 100 employees, we do have several different groups that represent some of those work groups. AFSCME represents our public works, maintenance operators and water plant operators and mechanics. The Fraternal Order of Police represents our public safety sworn officers, and then the remainder of our staff is unrepresented. There is a contractual increase built in for our AFSCME employees, our public works line workers. That is the 4th year of a 4-year contract. And so hence that 2.75%, which would take effect March 1st. As per contract. And then a delayed start for a cost of living adjustment for non-union employees. And this is something that we have not done, but in an effort to further limit some of those early budget impacts, not understanding fully where those impacts might be, we wanted to preserve that option for us as we move forward. And then finally, the FOP's contract is up on February 28th of 2021. We have not included anything relative to that particular contract because negotiations have not begun. So that's something that we'll be looking at and talking about with the board, even perhaps as the budget process proceeds before the end of 2020. One note, and we've talked about this many, many times, most recently over in our last meeting last month relative to actuarial recommendations. Our police pension fund is continuing to be a significant increase in terms of investment, an annual required investment. We anticipate about an 18% increase in calendar year 21, which is represented by that number there on the screen, $325,276. I've mentioned there's been some significant growth, obviously, in our pension funding requirements. Going back to fiscal year 18 and then being inclusive of calendar year 21, we are looking at about a 48.6% increase overall in our police pension funding requirements. That's determined primarily by some changes made legislatively in Springfield, but it is certainly creating a significant impact in our overall budgetary efforts. So we'll talk a bit more about that momentarily. And last in this particular section is the short-term overhire in the water fund. Dave Mao will talk a bit about this, but this is focused primarily on succession planning at our water treatment plant and some anticipated retirements that are coming up. We will be talking through some of the proposed continued investment in our operations as well as our infrastructure. At this point, all of those investments are anticipated to utilize reserves, whether that be in the general fund, water fund, capital projects fund, or golf fund, and we'll be talking about that and whether that is the direction that the committee and the board ultimately would like to pursue into the calendar year 21 budget. And then last, we have been, and the committee certainly has been as well, talking a bit about future financing for infrastructure and the investments that are necessary across a number of our work areas. That includes potential referenda in the future. as well as additional alternate revenue bond issuances in the water fund to continue to pay for those water fund improvements. Our overall CIP, as included in the draft budget, is just over $51 million, a significant portion of which anticipates financing over the next 10-year period of time. We will briefly touch on some thoughts that we have leading into calendar 21 on that subject. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Nikki. Actually, Nikki, am I taking this next slide? I should have.
Feel free.
Okay.
If you'd like.
Just the last item really. Tonight is not about decision making. It's about discussion and about gathering feedback and insights from the board that we will integrate and take back and then update our budget for a formal presentation at the November 19th Village Board meeting, and then ultimate consideration of the budget in December at our board meeting in December. But we will be seeking some feedback from you on the fee and fine analysis that is included in tonight's presentation, as well as the various recommendations on department operations and the CIP. So as we work through that, we are going to encourage commentary and questions on how we've prioritized, and we'll be sharing some prioritization information with you as well. So with that, Nikki, I will kick it back to you.
Okay, thank you, Manager Corrali. Okay, throughout, just a quick note before we get started, throughout the presentation, we have included page numbers where applicable within the PowerPoint presentation. So that would allow folks following at home, these are printed page numbers, not the PDF page number. So if you're following with the electronic version, this is the actual printed page number. So getting started at the beginning, from pages 10 to 28, included in the budget document is the financial forecast. We did discuss this at length at the last Finance Committee meeting, but there are just a few highlights that we did want to review this evening. The forecast, as usual, is a 5-year forecast. It includes the general, water, and motor fuel tax funds, and it runs from 2021 through 2025. There's a few main factors that are affecting the forecast. Some are repeats from last year that we have been working with for quite some time. Obviously, as Manager Corrali mentioned, necessary infrastructure improvements remain a focus of the budget and of the village's strategic plan. Adjusting for future state budget impacts, this is one of the many unknowns as a result of COVID-19, as a result of the potential referendum outcome in November. So we will be continuing to monitor sales tax, income tax, and use tax, which are particularly sensitive to changes by the state of Illinois. And also the forecast assumes declines in telecom tax, personal property replacement tax, and E911 surcharge disbursements. And all of those run through the state of Illinois and are susceptible to legislative changes. I think we've beat this one quite a bit, the public safety pension costs. The forecast includes a 5% escalator through the 5-year forecast. That may be light, but as you may recall from last month's discussion, our goal is to come forward with the committee to have a discussion about a formal funding policy with the village's actuary. And our hope is to start making some progress, some real progress on that unfunded liability, and talk through some sustainable funding options. As well, debt financing, infrastructure needs, not only the infrastructure needs that we have, but how will we pay for them? There is a financing plan included with the CIP when we go through that. So we'll be asking for some feedback, but there is the potential for about 15 million in referendum bonds over the next 5 years. That was baked into the financial forecast, assuming everything goes as planned, which we all know won't happen. Let's see. The other thing is designing fee structures around costs. We are continuing water revenue increases in accordance with the water rate study, and I won't spend too much time on this because I know Assistant Finance Director Joseph is going to review that. If you follow along with the attachments, specifically on page 25, the forecast is projecting a positive fund balance in all funds, which is particularly notable in the general fund because this has not been the case in previous forecasts. This harkens back to this committee's influence and the responsibility of the village board, policy changes that we have made, and really an indication of financial health that we just didn't have as strongly as before. The forecast also reflects planned capital spending included in our 10-year plan, and all of these figures have been updated for the latest and greatest budget numbers. Lastly, the last attachment of the forecast are the revenue loss scenarios. Those have been updated since the budget draft was printed. Thank you, Trustee Rubin, helped us find a little bit of a formula error there, but the PDF document has been updated, and that just shows the potential exposure for the village if there were to be a property tax levy freeze, which we are fortunately, knock on wood, not seeing as much traction on, but also potential for a reduction in income or sales tax, which unfortunately have become very real possibilities for us. So that's something that we will continue to monitor on a monthly basis. Are there any questions on the financial forecast before we move on? Okay, hearing none, I'm going to hand it over to Assistant Finance Director Joseph to go through our policy.
Thank you. The financial policies begins on page 30 of your budget document. Based on discussions at the August Finance Committee meeting, the following are just policies that required key updates. The first one is the fund balance policy. Given the uncertainty of the duration of the financial impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, staff is recommending a 1-year suspension of the budgeted contingency for STARCOM radio replacements this year. In addition, a placeholder of $60,000 is included in the budget for delayed cost of living adjustments for non-union employees. This would be effective July 1, 2021. The policy also includes a one-time transfer of any possible increases in building permit revenue to the capital projects fund to fund future capital projections. The second policy is the property tax abatement. Included in the budget is the abatement of alternate water revenue bonds. These bonds will be abated and paid from water fund revenues. As we all know, this bond issue was entirely dedicated to fund the water fund infrastructure projects. The total payment aggregated is approximately $181,000. And pension funding, we discussed this. The recommendation was to go ahead and move forward with the village actuaries required funding amount of $2.5 million for the police pension fund and approximately $50 million for the fire pension, $50,000, my apologies, for the fire pension contribution. Both have been budgeted in the draft calendar year budget. The final policy is the IRMA liability policy and surplus. As you know, IRMA is the village's risk management agency. The recommendation is to use excess surplus up to $250,000 to offset any deductibles and premiums. Happy to answer any questions before we move on to fee and fine schedule. Okay, so moving on to the fee and fine schedule. Annually, as part of the budget development process, staff reviews various fees and charges for village services and distributes a fee survey to surrounding communities in an effort to collect data that would allow us to analyze and compare our fees to those of comparable communities. During our review this year, there were a number of fees that staff had identified for increases. However, due to the ongoing economic effect of the pandemic, we wanted to reduce the impact to residents and are not recommending any increases in vehicle licenses, alarm permits, ambulance billing, just to name a few of our charges and fees. The recommended increases to existing rates are limited to those fees that have a direct impact on ensuring that there are sufficient funding for future infrastructure improvements. There's a lot of detail in your budget document beginning on page 42, so I'll just provide you a high-level overview of the following fee modifications. The first one is the water rate. Staff is recommending a 8% increase based on the water rate analysis that was completed in fiscal year 2018. The increase ensures continued reinvestment in our distribution system, which was the basis of our study. The second one is the sanitary sewer rate. Staff is recommending a 5% increase to fund a portion of the infrastructure improvements, such as the sanitary sewer lining, which is mandated by the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency and the Metropolitan Water Reclamation Districts. This requires the village to line every sanitary sewer within the next 20 years. The 10-year CIP also includes approximately $3.4 million in scheduled improvements, infrastructure improvements. Next item is the general collection service fee. As part of the franchise agreement with LRS, the village board had directed staff to develop quarterly fees that would eliminate the general fund subsidy. So included in here is a 2.3% increase in the general collection services fee, which is consistent with the 12-month change in CIP that is used for the property tax levy. Also included is the golf club rates. Staff is recommending a modest increase, weekday and weekend green fees, increase of $1, senior membership cards in Birdie Key, $2, Eagle Key, $5, and permanent tee times, $20. Okay. The following are recommended new fees that staff has identified as areas for process improvement, as well as an effort to just defray some of the administrative cost. The first one is the downtown right-of-way use fee. This would be a permit fee for permission to place equipment such as dumpsters in the public right-of-way in the downtown business district for repairs of commercial buildings. The extended use of sidewalk and parking spaces in the downtown impacts businesses. This right-of-way use fee would expedite a contractor's presence. The fee structure is based on a number of hours and days that will range from $100 to about $500 plus. The second one is the Plan Commission appearance review. This is consistent with the Zoning Board of Appeals application process. This is an application fee of $100 per occurrence to cover the administrative time involved in reviewing a submittal for Plan Commission consideration. And the third item on here is the alterations to approved architectural and engineering plans. Again, this is recommending a flat fee for staff's review time after the initial 2 hours to cover the cost of the service. And then residential development tree removal and preservation plan fee. Staff is recommending a fee ranging from $300 to $500 for the tree removal and preservation plan review and site inspection. This is for residential development projects. Currently, this is provided by a third-party consultant. Staff is looking to recover some of that cost that the village is incurring. For future review, staff will provide additional analysis during calendar year 2021 on business license regulations. This was a strategic plan initiative that was delayed due to the COVID-19 pandemic response. In addition, a more thorough analysis will be conducted on management fees to determine whether the current fees for the golf club and the waterfront adequately recover the actual cost of administrative services that is provided. And then lastly, a reminder, the 1% non-home rule places of eating tax that was approved during the stub year 2020 budget that was deferred earlier this year due to the COVID-19 pandemic will go into effect on January 1, 2021. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have on fees and fines.
I just have a question on the Plan Commission appearance fee.
Mhm.
Is that something that other communities do where you need to pay to request something of the committee?
Yes, that is a application fee that other communities do charge.
And it's also consistent with the process that we use with the zoning board. Is that right, Dave?
Yes, correct. And
Mhm.
just to clarify, it's downtown exterior appearance review. So it only applies to matters that have to come before the Plan Commission by code for exterior appearance review. And there's quite a bit of staff time involved, just as much, if not more, than a zoning appeal.
Okay, I just didn't know if it meant, you know, the Plan Commission. Okay, that makes sense.
Any other questions? Okay, I'll turn this over now to Finance Director Larson.
Thank you. Okay, so moving on to pages 47 to 51 in the budget, that section of the budget provides an overview and a high level of all of our aggregated revenue and expenditures. So the budget as proposed, as Manager Corrali indicated in the operating funds, is just over 28 million in revenue and just over 28 million in expenditures. When you include, Yep.
Sorry, I was just having a trouble, you know, we've got numbers back, let's see, so this, I'm comparing pages 25 and 47. And we're covering similar ground, doing it a little differently. So I'm just trying to reconcile, for example, government funds general expense number for calendar year 2021 on page 47, which is what you're just talking about. It starts off that top line number of 20,869 and change as an expense number, but the number back on 25 is a little different. So I was just wondering how to reconcile the expense numbers.
Great question. So in the financial forecast, so what we're comparing for the folks at home following along is the total general fund budget that's indicated on the operating statements on page 47 versus the actual financial forecast attachment, which is page 25. The 20 million, hold on. 20,869,739 is the total expense number, including capital. So if you were to look on page 25 and take that 18,906,735 number and then add it to that, wait, hold on. I think I have an outdated number here.
Yeah, see, they don't.
It should be, that number needs to be updated.
Okay, because I was going to say, that's what I was doing. Yeah, that's what I was doing with a calculator just briefly a couple of times and realized they didn't match up. So I thought one might have been updated from the other.
It's a good question. Yep, we went back and forth with capital, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a moment, but that's a great question.
And for everybody else, it's not huge, but I just couldn't get them to tie. So, you know, I'm anal enough that I had to ask.
That's a good question. Okay, and we will update that figure for the final budget. Originally, we had talked about some alternate funding sources for capital, but that number has increased to 2,301. So if you add the capital number plus that operating, that's how you get to that number.
Okay, all right,
so, good question.
All right, thanks.
And we're going to get to that in a moment, that exact page, that 47. Okay, so when we're aggregating all of the expenses and we include the pension funds, those numbers jump to 31.8 in revenue and 32.4, 32.5 in expenditures. Unfortunately, these two, as we noted earlier, are statutorily controlled, so there's very little that the village can do in terms of the pension fund budgets. Included.
Controlled by the state.
Correct, yes. Statutory by the state, yes. Included in the budget, as noted just earlier, There is a one-time use of reserves for capital. When the right number is included, you'll see a $1.7 million use of general fund reserves, which we'll get into in a moment. And there is $155,000 proposed in the capital projects fund that Dave will explain later. And that's the amount that's remaining on our limited tax bond proceed. And then in the 10-year community investment plan that we'll be going through, there is $51.7 million programmed over the next 10 years, with $3.6 million proposed in the coming year budget, and that's across all funds. So this is on page 47, as we were just discussing. So this is perfect. Updated numbers here. So this is broken down, moving from left to right. You have the general fund, capital projects, debt service fund. These are all your governmental funds here. Special revenue funds, motor fuel tax, our enterprise funds, which are largely self-sustaining, and our pension funds, which are largely controlled by the state. One thing I'd like to highlight here is the general fund, and as you'll see in a moment, this is the largest focus of our presentation because it's the largest concentration of our budget. When you take the operating expenses and the capital and subtract it from what we are projecting in revenue, currently we have about a $1.7 million deficit. If we were to remove all of the capital from the general fund budget, we would actually have a $344,000 surplus in the general fund. So one of the items that we're going to ask for some feedback this evening, and again, as Manager Corrali indicated, we don't necessarily need a decision this evening, but just more so feedback, is what, if any, of these capital items would we like to proceed with, and how we would like to finance those. And when we get into the CIP, we'll talk a little bit more about options that are available to the village and how you would like to move forward with that. So that number we'll come back to. The other thing I'd like to point out here is that, as Manager Corrali annotated earlier, we are using reserves or fund reserves or contingency amounts in many of our funds for capital. The golf club is one of those. This number is a proposed drawdown for largely capital numbers or capital projects. And all of the funds, with the exception of the golf club, will be coming within their budgetary targets or fund balance targets in accordance with policy. Also, if all goes as planned with the budget, these fund balances that we are proposing, we would expect to end the year with a 24.5% fund balance in the general fund, 73.2% in the water fund, and those equivalencies in months are listed here. The water fund is a little bit higher because we do have some bond proceeds there involved.
Nikki,
Okay.
before we move on from that one, can you just explain the fund balance in the golf club?
Yes, thank you. That's a good place to highlight. So as we have discussed in prior finance committee meetings, there is a large liability in the golf club fund, and that is made up of a combination of a one-time loan that the village issued to the golf club for some outstanding debt, and then also unpaid management fees. So those amounts have aggregated, and there was interest charged on an annual basis. And the final amount, I think, is somewhere in the ballpark. Hold on one moment. Just pull this up because it's in our policies. It's about $549,000 in management fees. So all in management fees and the loan, it's about $1.8 million. So by recording that liability in the golf club fund, it does artificially deflate their fund balance number, which is why this number appears negative. Does that help, Phil?
Is there any corresponding artificial inflation of the general fund?
there is.
So
So
the
to,
two of them offset each other to zero.
correct. In an aggregate, when you look at everything together village-wide, it offsets to zero. To, I guess, undo this transaction, you would have to do it one of two ways. Either the golf club would need to repay the village that dollar amount, or you would need to write it off. So that would be something, I know this committee has discussed that previously. An option to write that off might be in installments. We've previously discussed the collection of management fees at a more reasonable level, something that's a little bit more sustainable for the golf course than what had previously been calculated. And in exchange for a collection of a management fee, then it would be possible to, maybe write that loan off over a series of several years. I don't want to steal Stella's thunder because I know she'll talk a little bit about this later, but as part of the fundraising process, in discussions about the golf course project, this was something that came up as a concern of something that we may want to address before proceeding with that project. So that would require to write that off, would reflect from an accounting perspective an inflow into the golf club fund and a decline in the general fund corresponding. So in aggregate, that would net to zero. When you look at the two funds individually, that's how it would appear as a positive and a negative.
Are we going over the surplus or the deficit for the year, the 510,000 during Stella's part of the presentation?
Yes, so Stella will be talking about the reason for that is the capital projects. So we'll be talking about that a little bit later. Good question. Anything else on this slide?
One other thing, just as it
Okay.
relates, we're talking about payables and receivables and how they net out overall to the village as a whole for those two. But for example, the cash balance, whatever that number is, that's the golf club has that appear on that sheet, that is included though in, the cash element of the fund balance as a whole, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So again, it kind of is a way of presenting the accounting, and there may be other elements to it, but at the end of the day, in terms of operationally, it's more about appearance, perhaps.
Correct.
And what you decide to do with the money than anything else.
Correct. So that positive there, it does reflect a positive operating budget, a positive cash flow in the golf course.
Right. A very amazingly well run,
a significant
part of
positive
our village. Yeah. Kudos to Stella and her whole team. I just wanted to point that out. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I think it's worth pointing out that all of the debt and the stuff that we're talking about was run up long before Stella took over. And Stella totally reversed all that and put the golf club on a very sound financial footing. And it's been contributing positively for many years as a result of what Stella has done and continues to do. So it's a historic anomaly we're looking at. I'm sorry, Denise, go forth.
Okay. When aggregating revenues for the village's operating funds, this chart shows the breakdown by fund. Again, we will be focusing primarily on the general fund this evening, as it's almost 70% of the entire budget. Moving down from there, our water fund is about 16.5%, with the golf club following with about 6.4%, and the debt service in there as well. In terms of budgeted expenditures, again, no surprise, general fund is the largest portion of the budget. That's where pretty much our daily operations are funded from. And then again, followed in this similar order, water fund, golf club, and debt service with respective portions. Okay, If there are no more questions about the budget as a whole, I'd like to move into the departmental budgets. Each of the department heads will take turns presenting their department budget. Please stop us if you have questions midstream. Our first budget is going to be the finance department, and I will turn it over to Assistant Finance Director Joseph, who will present this budget.
Thank you. The finance department includes 6 full-time employees who provide services in accounting and financial reporting, budgeting, risk management, payroll, benefit administration, utility billing, as well as all aspects of purchasing, including accounts payable and receivable. The draft budget for calendar year 2021 includes $1.7 million in expenditures. I do want to note that the lion's share of the expenditures within the finance department are fixed and driven by contractual services, such as auditing, actuarial services, financial advisor, as well as the annual mailing and fulfillment services for our vehicle and pet licensing. Also included in the budget is a projected premium of $298,000 from the village's insurance carrier for general liability, property, and workers' compensation claims. However, as mentioned earlier during the discussion on the financial policies, this expense is recommended to be offset by a one-time $250,000 drawdown of excess reserves that the village has on deposit with IRMA. As part of the strategic plan initiatives, the finance department budget includes continued investment into professional development and education for staff, including review course and materials for the Certified Public Finance Officer examinations, leadership training, and continued education in the areas of payroll, accounting, and financial reporting. In addition, finance staff is heavily involved in ERP implementation. This included the recent configuration and implementation of the utility billing software, and staff is currently in the early stages of payroll configuration with an anticipated go live in calendar year 2021. Also, as we discussed during the financial policies, there is a $200,000 transfer to the Capital Projects Fund, which will be made pending revenues from the new residential construction permits. Are there any questions on the Finance Department draft budget? Okay, if there are no questions, I will hand this over to Public Safety Director Lewandowski to provide an overview on the public safety budget.
Okay, good evening. Thank you. I just wanted to spend a few minutes talking about some of the highlights in our budget. This year, our budget is roughly $9.7 million. I wanted to start with contractual services, as these are recurring items that we have every year. As you know, we have a partnership with Family Service at Glencoe. They provide 24/7 crisis social service responses for public safety. They also offer mental health resource referrals and alternatives to criminal proceedings for subjects in crisis. This relationship continues to provide mutual benefit for both parties as well as the residents of Glencoe. We're in year 2 of a 3-year contract, and new this year is a rate increase, the first one in over 8 years, to the fees that are billed to the village from Family Service of Glencoe. The second item is Glenview Dispatch Services. Since 2017, Glenview's provided full service dispatch for us. They answer emergency and non-emergency police, fire, and EMS calls for us. They do administrative calls. We're in year 4 of a 6-year contract. We're very satisfied with the services. Everything's working very well. The relationship with Glenview has also helped us save money on smaller projects that we're cost sharing with the entire Glenview group of agencies that they dispatch for. Things like our Smart 911 system, our electronic traffic crash and traffic citation programs, our live scan machine which connects our fingerprints to the state of Illinois. So some of the ancillary cost benefits that were associated with our contract with Glenview are saving the village money as well. The third item is Winnetka Fire Inspection Services. We're in year 2 of a kind of an open-ended contract that can be renewed every year. As you know, fire inspections require extensive training and experience. It's difficult for our agency to manage that due to providing police, fire, and EMS. Our officers get plenty of training across the board. The additional training required for inspections is difficult for us, so we entered into a contract with Winnetka. And again, they've been very responsive, very reactive. It's cost effective for us. They inspect all 115 businesses in Glencoe every year, which is more than we were able to do even when we had a staff, just because of our time constraints. And the fourth contract is the school crossing guard contract we have with Andy Frayne. We're in year 2 of a 5-year contract with them. While this contract is slightly higher cost than what it used to cost when we employed the part-time crossing guards, public safety staff now can focus on their main jobs, and the vendor manages the entire program. They recruit, they schedule, they make sure there's relief, they guarantee coverage, and there's no workers' comp liability for us whatsoever. In addition, School District 35 partners with us every year on the cost of the contract. They donate up to 15 to 20% of the overall fees. In fact, this year, due to COVID, the school district is having a hybrid schedule, which doubled the amount of crossings per day. And the school district has agreed to take on the entirety of those costs. So it won't cost the village anything as we extended that contract with Andy Frayne. Second item I want to talk about is personnel. Our salary and benefits is obviously the biggest part of our budget. The police pension increase kind of overshadowed our operation cuts this year. In operations, we cut about 14% of our costs. However, the large rate increase for the police pension funding kind of overshadowed that for us. We're going to enter calendar year 21 carrying 35 sworn officers out of 36. If you recall, in April, we had a resignation, and due to the uncertainty regarding revenues related to COVID, we decided to hold off on filling that position. And as Manager Crowley mentioned earlier, our plan is to fill that position in July of 2021, once we have a new eligibility list in place. Our salary costs have remained pretty stable, and our overtime costs have gone down because we've been fully staffed. So we're using our backfill for training more often than daily staffing, since we're fully staffed. Third item is CIP, which this year is only vehicle replacements. The 2 vehicles that we're requesting replacement this year were slated to be replaced in stub year 2020. They were pushed to calendar year 21 due to COVID. In reality, one of the vehicles we're talking about is going to be repurposed. So we're actually looking to have 3 new cars for the price of 2. 2 patrol vehicles we're proposing to get new cars for and trade in one of them, and one of the patrol vehicles, while it has high mileage, still has some use because there's no major defects and no repair history. So we're going to repurpose that as an administrative vehicle and trade in one of our administrative vehicles, which is about 7 years old, has 80,000 miles, and it's had numerous problems with the electrical system, brake system, and there's some leaking in the trunk compartment, which has led to some mold issues that we've had to eradicate. So our proposal is to get, like I said, 3 new cars on the front line by buying 2 and repurposing 1. Strategic plan initiatives focus on training and professional development. It's a large portion of our operational budget. Just to give you some perspective, so far this year, we've had 4,600 hours of training for the department, which is about 128 per officer. By this time last year, we had over 7,600 hours, or 275 per officer. So in 2021, we're going to concentrate on catching up to conform to state mandates, maintain our certifications and specialized skills, and to meet the prerequisites for advanced training for some of our officers. Due to COVID in the summer of 2020, all outside vendor training was canceled. Our continuing education for paramedics and fire certifications was greatly reduced or canceled in 2020. And again, we have ILETSB mandates, which we're focusing on now more than ever due to the civil unrest and police reform movements. Things like mental health, procedural justice, de-escalation, use of force and authority, civil rights, cultural competence, and implicit bias. We're going to focus on those And in 2020, we were relatively stable with those due to our in-service roll call training that we do every day through our Lexapol vendor, our Court Smart and Police Law Institute online trainings, which focus on those items. So we've stayed steady with those, but our other skills training that we're behind on, we're going to focus on in 2021. And the last item I want to talk about was grants. In 2020, we were successful in gaining 2 grants from FEMA. One of them was for the source capture vehicle exhaust system we talked about last month on the board agenda. And the second one was air purifying respirators, which we got on a COVID grant to protect our officers and paramedics from COVID. In all, we got $88,000 worth of equipment for $4,400 out of the village. These FEMA grants require a 5% match, so we got a lot of equipment with big value for a very small amount of money. In 2021, we're going to seek a grant for new self-contained breathing apparatus, or SCBA packs, for our fire service. The packs we have now are end of life. We're 2 production cycles out, so there's no software upgrades that we can do anymore. The total amount of this grant will be $140,000 for 20 units. And again, if we apply our 5% portion, if we are lucky enough to get the grant, it would only cost the village $7,000 to get $140,000 worth of equipment. So we are hopeful. We submitted it this year. It was pushed till next year because we got some other things through FEMA. So we're hoping in the new budget cycle, we'll be able to get those funds. Those are the highlights, and I'll happy to answer any questions you may have.
So I just have a quick question about the training and professional development.
Yes, sir.
How do you guys decide what we should be doing from a training perspective? Is that state driven, or do we as a village control some of it too?
It's about half and half. Some of it is state driven, whether it's a state fire marshal with the certifications for all of our fire training, or the Illinois Law Enforcement Training and Standards Board, like I said, with those mandates. The things that we control the most is our specialized skills that some of our officers have, whether they're on a specialized task force outside of here, or if just on the police side, for instance, whether they become an evidence technician or a field training officer, things like that. We just determine it based on need, basically. If we have a lot of, as we have a lot of turnover in employees, as employees leave with a lot of specialized skills, we've got to re-up that with junior officers as that happens. So we control about half of it. The state controls the other half of it.
And then some of the subjects that have been coming up recently, do we do research on the types of training we're doing, or how does that all even get decided? Am I making sense?
Yeah, I think you're talking about the police reform movements.
Yeah, or mental health, or any of those sorts of things.
Yes, all those things are part of the mandates that ILETSB has for us. And those are the things that we did remain current on. We do that through our online stuff, through our policy updates and scenario situations. So we remain current with that. So those I'm not so worried about. It's just the specialized skills that, again, we lost some senior officers, and this year we plan to get some junior officers up to speed. So now we're about a year behind that.
Okay. And part of the reason why I ask is our public safety, I mean, we have a great reputation, and
right,
making sure that we maintain that by having the right training programs in place is, I mean, you guys are doing a great job just making sure, just wondering how we come up with that sort of stuff.
It's a mixture, like I said.
And I should add that there are various places and things that we do that set requirements. Unlike most of the United States, most of Northern Illinois have similar approaches to public safety that we do in terms of training. And then there's CALEA has a whole bunch of things that they require, and most all of us are either met the CALEA standards or CALEA certified. And so in terms of the training that's been talked about on a national level for public safety and the things that they're talking about as reform, we've already done all of those and continue to do them. The biggest unknown there for the future has to do with what the Illinois legislature may do as a response to all this, based on various approaches being taken by the Black Caucus of the Illinois legislature based on a bunch of things going on in Chicago and the members from Chicago. And those are unknowns, and we're, until the legislature gets its act together, we may end up being way ahead of all that, or there may be some strange and different things that we'll be required to do. But we're very fortunate in that Kerry has kept our department way ahead of most of the departments in the United States on training. Sorry to interrupt, but I thought that's something that we should mention.
Thanks.
Hey, Chief, this is Pete Mulvaney.
Yes, sir.
And I should say I'm sorry for being late to the rest of the trustees. I was able to join about 10 after 6. So thanks, Chief. I wanted to make 2 points. One is it'd be nice to see the roll up of the training. I think that's an important enough category where it ought to show up in the graphic so that we have a good sense of it. I assume that the training budget is rolled into personnel at the moment. The other comment I have is about the vehicle replacement, and just want to make sure that we are thinking about efficiency, fuel efficiency, carbon footprint around our vehicle fleet, whether they be for admin purposes or public safety. I just want to make sure that that's at least given some consideration.
It is actually in the CIP write-up. We indicated in there, model year 2020 was the first year where Ford offered hybrid as a standard operating drivetrain for the vehicles. So this will be 2021. It'll be the second year of that generation, and we're going to explore those options when we go to purchase the cars, if approved.
Great, thank you.
And Peter, while it wasn't on the graphic, the detailed expenditures for public safety indicates about $105,000 budget item separately for training.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's an important item to call out. I think a lot of the public is interested in this, and it shows a commitment to the force here that we're making. So,
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? All right, thank you. I'll turn it over to Dave Mao for the Public Works Department.
Yes, the Public Works Department's proposed calendar year 21 budget request includes a little more than 7.25 million in expenditures. I want to touch on 4 primary areas with you this evening. The first is our contractual area of contractual services. The budget includes funding to continue to use contractual services for plan review and building inspection services, commercial plan review, and our plan review and field inspection for our enforcement of our tree preservation ordinance for residential development. And coupled with that, I would note within our building division, where we incurred a near 100% turnover in 2019, if you recall. Staffing efforts over the last 7 months have been outstanding, working us towards a building permit process that's fully electronic, both for plan submittal and review, online inspection scheduling, and moving all our forms online for electronic PDF fillable field format. It's been extremely well received in the development community, created significant efficiencies, and it's due in large part to the new staff that came on board in the last year. Each and every one of them highly skilled professionals. The next category I just talked a minute about personnel. Within the Public Works General Fund, there of the total 44 Public Works employees in the budget, 30 of whom are in the General Fund. Vacant positions, we had a maintenance equipment operator in our Public Works Department retired in July. That position remains unfilled, and as noted earlier this evening, we are because of the unknowns with our budget revenue, we are holding the line and are looking to keep that position vacant at least through the middle of 21. And that's not a small task. That's required a concerted additional effort with our seasonal staff who support our full-time MEO staff, as well as our excellent supervisory staff under the direction of our general superintendent. The cost of living adjustment is noted earlier as well. 29 members of the Public Works Department are members of AFSCME Local 2324. They will enter into the third year of a 3-year agreement in March of 2021, and the cost of living adjustment to annual wages and merit pay as part of that agreement is 2.75. So that is included in the proposed budget. In the CIP, we've got a slightly pared down CIP proposed budget for calendar year 21. A couple highlights. There are 4 pieces of equipment in vehicles in that list, 2 of which are extremely high priority and are back around. One is the sewer vac that was deferred from the stub year budget. That's as we noted before, that's a critical piece of equipment used to maintain the village's storm and sanitary sewer system. That's an 11-year-old piece of equipment that is out on the street virtually every day of the year. It is showing the wear and tear is showing on this equipment. We've done well to keep it in operation, but breakdowns on this truck are not small. And our fleet division estimates we could be looking at $80,000 in necessary repairs on this piece of equipment in the next 2 years, which is not something we're interested in doing. We can avoid it. And the other large piece that is a high priority is one of 2 10-wheel, 2.5-ton dump trucks. These are dual axle heavy duty trucks that are workhorses across all divisions within the department, and are also equipped with plows and salt spreaders that are used on our main arterial routes in our snow and ice control program. The other project to talk about is our sanitary sewer improvements. 2 items of note we have included in the budget engineering for evaluation of a section of a sanitary force main. It's the only sanitary main that really exists exclusively in private ravine property. That's a 80-plus-year-old pipe that's is in a near failed condition and is only kept open and functional with aggressive maintenance. And the second is the ongoing effort with the sanitary sewer ICAP program. As you recall, this is the MWRD's program to reduce inflow and infiltration into the village's sanitary sewer system. And I want to note something said earlier, and we'll get it corrected in this draft budget. The village does not have a mandate to line every sewer in 20 years. We do have a requirement to evaluate 2% of our sanitary sewer system each year. We've elected to lump that together, and in a 3-year period, we are now moving into, in calendar year 21, our second priority area that we'll spend 3 years in investigating and evaluating, and then identifying rehabilitation that's necessary to reduce I&I. And that rehabilitation does include sanitary main lining if the structural condition of the pipe warrants it. Also extremely important are manhole rehabilitation. And then there's the private sector contribution that is an equal contributor, but even more challenging to correct because it requires mandating private property improvements. So that's an ongoing program that's mandated by the MWRD. And then lastly, just to highlight sidewalk replacement, there are 2 sidewalk items. One is the continuation of our downtown brick paver restoration, moving into year 4. That's proven to be extremely successful. just to remove and replace and restore the existing brick paver walkways where we've experienced differential settlement and some cracking. All in all, that product has held up extremely well. And so there's another additional phase included in of that. And then our residential program, with the COVID impact this year, we had to shut half of our sidewalk program down. We're only doing an infill sidewalk section up on Dundee Road that was identified in the active transportation plan, and some minor residential walk replacement that's in some critical areas. We have 40 plus miles of sidewalk. We have some catch up to do in the southern third of the village, and so we've got an increase, at least in the proposed budget, for that work to continue. Under strategic plan initiatives, training and professional development on the public works side includes in the general fund includes the professional development for our and licensing for our professional staff, both in engineering and community development, as well as certifications for our 3 fleet mechanics. And so there's a total of a little over 14,000 in training in the general fund public works budget. ERP implementation, primary here is our part in assisting the finance department in the transition to the new utility billing software as it relates to the water meter, system-wide water meter change out. And then as we look ahead, plans for, which probably will transition into the following fiscal year, calendar year, would be a transition into the community development module within the ERP. And then lastly, just included in here are two items that one of which should not be new to you, are some plans to do program analysis in 2 areas of our operations. One is our sidewalk snow plowing plan. As we talked over the summer, we are moving ahead with a modified pilot program this winter to reduce the footprint of sidewalk that we clear, still focusing on safety and on high traffic, high priority areas. Staff will be reviewing the effectiveness and efficiency of that program in the spring of 21, including seeking public comment, public input on how that all goes this winter. And we expect to bring back the results and a recommendation to the village board about the necessary investment in this program going forward. Case in point, there's a replacement of a sidewalk plow in the calendar year 21 budget set towards the end of the year. We do have, even if we continue in a modified way, we will have a need to replace one of our existing sidewalk tractors, but we need more information before we would bring that recommendation to you. The second is in the area of Parkway leaf collection program, which gets underway, the shameless plug, next Monday. So get busy this weekend. But the village's leaf collection is a service component of our franchise agreement with Lakeshore Recycling System. And as part of that agreement, Lakeshore uses the village's leaf trailer units and their own trucks. And they also take advantage of the village's disposal site at the Botanic Garden. LRS has informed the village, they've made no bones about it, that's a service they're not interested in continuing to provide when the franchise expires in 2 years. So staff is already beginning to talk about looking to put out an RFP for the service prior to the end of that LRS contract, see if there's a more cost-effective way to bring in a separate contractor. And again, and the outcome of that evaluation and recommendation will determine our necessary investment in additional equipment for that service going forward. So again, there's a leaf vacuum in the budget, but it's pushed towards the end of the year, pending the outcome of that analysis.
Did LRS say why they don't want to continue?
It was kind of a carrot that was included in the franchise agreement. They were the only one of, I think, the 4 that submitted it wasn't mandatory that submitted proposals that even had a pricing for that. It's extremely labor intensive, and they aren't using any of their full-time people. They're bringing in contract labor to work under our direction. It's been more. There's a real, that service is as much art as it is science. We have it down well, but no disputing that's the reason we wanted to contract it out. It's highly labor intensive, and so there are contractors that provide that service holistically, and so the intent is to put that out and see what kind of pricing we could get for it. So that concludes the report on the operational Public Works Department proposed budget. I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Well, I'll go ahead, darn it. Mulvaney. Hey, David, thanks. On that leaf collection, I know we put out education material for residents who have private leaf service to not leave the leaves out front. I'm regularly frustrated by seeing this continue to occur, and I wonder if it's worthwhile to increase our education on that part, or any type of enforcement that we might be able to do. Perhaps that alleviates some of the burden.
Actually, we don't prohibit that. What we do put out is information to make sure residents aren't paying for it twice.
Mm-hmm.
Their private landscape service can leave landscape waste, leaf collection from that client's property. Well, obviously, what we don't want is them bringing leaves from other clients and other communities.
Right.
But that has been permitted since the onset of our leaf collection program.
I see. Well, thanks for the correction. I appreciate that. Hmm.
Are there any other questions for Public Works before we move forward? Okay, I think we can turn it over to Jordan.
Thank you, Director Larson, and thank you, trustees. For 2021, the draft Village Manager's Office budget totals approximately $2.2 million in expenditures. So to compare that with the Village's most recent 12-month fiscal year, which was fiscal year 2020, the Manager's Office's budget represents a 5.7 or approximately $134,000 decrease in expenditures from fiscal year 20. So the following is an overview of the department's primary expenditures for next year. The first group of expenditures is contractual services. The first service is Corporation Counsel, which, as the board may recall, is comprised of the village's monthly retainer agreement with Elrod Friedman for legal services. The second service in this group is Labor Counsel, which is different, which includes legal services for contract negotiations. As Manager Crowley mentioned earlier in tonight's discussion, the village's current collective bargaining agreement with the Fraternal Order of Police, or FOP, expires in February 2021. So the 2021 budget includes Labor Counsel support to assist with these upcoming negotiations. And the last contractual services for 2021 includes communications consultant services to support the village's ongoing enhanced communication efforts. The reason for continued communication support is segueing into the next section is due to staff's recommendation for the elimination of the currently vacant full-time community engagement analyst, as well as the addition of a part-time administrative intern. So inclusive of the costs for the part-time administrative intern and communication support, the net savings of eliminating the vacant community engagement analyst position is approximately $50,000 for calendar year 2021. So again, net savings is about $50,000 for next year. So the next portion of expenditures for 2021 is our One Community Investment Program project, which, continuing our ERP theme, is the third year of our implementation of the village's new enterprise resource planning software, our ERP. Just want to make note that, again, this is our one CIP project. The village's council chambers redesign project, which was deferred earlier in stub year 2020, has not been included in the 2021 budget. And we are also recommending the deferral of switch replacements in our IT infrastructure, deferring those replacements to calendar year 2022. So the next group of expenditures, we are having strategic plan initiatives, or for strategic plan initiatives. First, we have funding for Glencoe University and other enhanced onboarding training opportunities. I do want to make note that the manager's office budget also includes organization-wide human resources and IT training, as well as specific training for manager's office employees. You'll see here, and as I mentioned earlier, ERP implementation, costs for that. And then last, for strategic plan initiatives, we've budgeted funds for special legal counsel for projects that fall outside of our corporation counsel and labor counsel contractual services. An example is what Assistant Finance Director Joseph mentioned earlier. In 2021, we have planned a comprehensive business license review process that will require outside legal counsel. And then the final component of the manager's office 2021 budget is community grants. As the board may recall, the board's community grants committee is comprised of several trustees and listens to presentations each year by grant applicants for annual awards. This year, the Community Grants Committee will be meeting on Thursday, November 5th, and pending the recommendations made by the Community Grants Committee, staff will input that number into final budget approval, and the board ultimately has that final discretion for the total community grants awards. So with that, that is a high-level overview of the manager's office budget, and I'd be happy to answer any questions at this time.
One item just to add to Jordan's comments this evening related to our corporation counsel with Elrod Friedman. You may recall this law firm is a new law firm that was created early on in we transitioned to actually just before the beginning of the stub year 20 budget. All of Elrod Friedman's rate structures that were put in place in February of 2020 will stay in place without any increases through the end of calendar 21. So the fee structures are all identical to the current fiscal year.
Are there any other questions on the manager's office budget? Okay, seeing none. Thank you, Jordan. I'm going to turn it over to Director Nanos. Stella, I think you're on mute. Oh, now we can hear you.
Sorry. Reviewing the budget, as Trustee Bree did note, we do have an expense budget of 2.3. Our revenue budget is 1.8, which does leave us at a deficit of 510,000. That does include spending $613,000 in capital, and some of those items are included in the CIP. I'm kind of taking this out of order, but the driving range protective netting is one of the larger capital projects that we were contemplating. That is $325,000. This is a very important project. It's something that's going to have to be taken out through a public process. It will have some neighbor impact, but it is something that we can do as quickly as next season that will bring in incremental revenue. We're estimating an ROI 5 years on that. And that is a project that can help us bring in additional funds to pay off a debt for the new clubhouse project. Other things that we have going on, our food and beverage service contract is over this year. We are going out to RFP to bring someone in. This continues to be a challenge because of the building and the way that it is currently set up. And we're hoping to get somebody in for at least a 2-year contract so we don't have to continue to try to find new people. We do have a very important promotion happening. We hired an assistant in training this year, Mario Moreno, and he's been doing excellent. We're moving him up to the second assistant superintendent. He does have some schooling that he is going to be taking over the winter. And this is succession planning for Dave Arden, who is our superintendent. Dave has not announced that he is going to retire anytime soon, but it will take a good amount of time for Mario to work with Dave to learn his skill set. And he's been doing a very good job so far. So along the lines of the training, Mario is going to be going to school. We have several organizations that our staff belongs to, the Golf Course Superintendents Association, the PGA of America, the Club Managers Association. All of these associations offer training throughout the season, and most of that is concentrated in the winter when it's our slow time. So all of the staff will be engaged in some sort of training. Fundraising for the clubhouse is also going to be a big push during the winter months. As I alluded to earlier, we are on track for getting people on board. During our workshop that was held last February, where we had several residents involved with our professional fundraiser, they did show some apprehension with raising funds for an organization that is holding on to debt. This was something that came up on several occasions and several different conversations with people, that if they want to donate to a 501c3, the Friends of the Glencoe Golf Club, they want to make sure that their donation and their money is going towards the new clubhouse project and not to offset old debt. So this is something that Nikki was describing earlier, the debt that's sitting on the books. I do appreciate the fact that we did recognize this was old debt. Nonetheless, it is there, and it is showing as a liability. It's something that's been on there for, I believe it started in 1995. So I think now is definitely the time to address this in any way that can not be a detriment to the village, but yet would be a benefit as we try to start raising funds in serious money. It's very important that we show that the Friends of the Glencoe Golf Club is not in debt when we start this campaign. It's very important. The rates were already reviewed. Management fee has been budgeted. It has been briefly reviewed what the fee is and the structure that goes into determining that management fee, but it has been budgeted for 2021. So any questions? A lot of information.
So if we look to forgive the debt, how do we go about doing that? How does it affect our books? Or not our, but the general fund books?
Stella, do you mind if I
No,
jump in? Okay. So Stella and I had talked about this and visited this topic with our financial advisor, because one of the obvious concerns from the village standpoint, you know, there's a great benefit to our golf club and there's a great benefit to the village in terms of the success of fundraising efforts. But there is also that corresponding concern of what might that mean in terms of writing off debt in the general fund and how that will look on our financial statements. Obviously, it would not be an ideal scenario to write off $1.9 million in a single year under any circumstance. From a rating agency standpoint, and as we start talking about the CIP, we will be before a rating agency within the near term again to fund capital. So the more structured and financially sound of an approach that we take, the better it will be viewed by our rating agency. So one of the suggestions that we thought would be feasible would be to do this over a series of years and maybe split up the loan into 3 installments or 4 installments and come forth with a formal agreement before the village that says, you know, understanding that this debt is not likely to be paid off in this magnitude by the golf course, understanding that there's some significant capital needs at the golf club that will need to be made. Could we do an exchange for a reasonable management fee and say, so long as the golf club can sustain a management fee that is reasonable, it would actually be looked upon favorably that we're cleaning up old debt that's not collectible off of our books in a responsible, measured manner.
Does
So
that
one of
help with getting it off the books so we can raise money though? I mean, if it's 4 years, we're trying to raise money sooner than that, aren't we?
We are. I think if you have an agreement in place from a fundraising standpoint that says the village has committed formally at the board level to write this off, I think it makes it a little bit easier to communicate to fundraisers that if you are contributing to the Friends of the Glencoe Golf Club, it's not going to be used to pay off this debt. It will go actually to the golf club construction. So I think that formal piece is key. We could certainly expedite it over, 2 years if we wanted to. I wouldn't recommend doing it in 1 year just because of the general fund hit. But as long as it's in an organized manner and in a formal action taken by the board, I think we can satisfy both the rating agency and the fundraising aspect of it. So that would be something that we would propose to bring before you in the coming months.
When you say the general fund hit, I mean, again, to go back to the previous discussion, the village net owes this to itself.
Correct.
And so it's increasing one number, it's decreasing another. So I think sometimes I'm hearing the word fund in a technical sense, and sometimes I'm hearing the word fund in a different sense in terms of what report we might be talking about. So I'm all in favor of cleaning something up that is historical and getting in our way of doing what we'd like to do. Make no mistake. I would think there ought to be a creative way, including the fact that, that's like there's cash in one account on our books versus saying it's in a different account, but it's still the village money. In terms of what element that plays in this for paying down some of the debt, restructuring the management fee and saying, okay, forget about the old management fee. Let's talk about a reasonable management fee going forward. I think there's got to be some creative ways to look at this, to move things around so our residents understand that net, nothing got thrown away, et cetera, by the village. And in point of fact, everything is as it was. It's just modernized and giving a better, more accurate view of the actual financial condition and performance of the village, as will be one of the benefits of doing this going forward.
And from a big picture philosophical standpoint, you're correct. It is somewhat of a left pocket, right pocket. Where we run into some complications is really that the Glencoe Golf Club is its own entity. It's a self-sustaining enterprise fund, and from a rating agency standpoint, it is legally separate because this board has established the golf club as its own fund. So from a rating agency standpoint, that's kind of where we get tangled because the original setup of this transaction was an interfund loan. And at one point it wasn't anticipated to be repaid. And since then it has grown. And at some point, if the loan is forgiven, there will need to be an expense that will add up to $1.9 million out of the general fund. And yes, you're, essentially from a cash standpoint, as one side to the other over the village umbrella. But from a financial reporting standpoint, the way we have to report it in the CAFR will be an expense, like a technically another financing source, but an
The
expense and a
expe-
revenue from a high level standpoint without getting too far into the weeds.
Even if the cash was just, even if for example, a chunk of cash that's currently sitting in the enterprise fund was used to pay a big chunk of this debt to the village, then from one fund to the other, there's that interfund transfer.
I think you're correct. You could do that.
I mean, again, then does that soften? Again, we need to figure out at the end of the day what we want to do and pursue a path to do it. And then taking into account the technical issue of how S&P might view it prior to a explanatory conversation, because do they really give us a better rating, because the two things are separate than if the things were merged, when it's still the liability of the village together?
They do. And Nikki, I don't want to step on your toes. I think this is a great conversation to have. It is something that we need to provide some additional information to the Finance Committee on. I think there are a number of components to this, not the least of which is the golf club needing to have resources available to it to function in its non-revenue producing months. There is a need to be very mindful of preservation of the village's coveted financial position. And I think you're exactly right, Trustee Rubin. There are more than one way. There is more than one way to find a reasonable solution to this that keeps all of those components whole. I do think it's going to take a little bit of time from the standpoint of a forgiveness cycle. And I think to Director Larson's point and Manager Nanos's point, there is value in the fundraising effort so that if there is a formal structure for a forgiveness, you're not talking about a loan repayment, you're talking about a forgiveness. And I think that difference is pretty significant from the standpoint of concerns that benefactors may have. So this is something we wanted to bring back up tonight. It's not something we've talked about for about a year. And I think had the year gone differently, we would have had this conversation back in August as we were leading into budget. But
Phil, I think it's fair to say at this point, there are a whole bunch of different ways to look at it and funds that we might set up within the village, et cetera. But we have so much energy, and because we had a 10-month cycle instead of a 12-month cycle, we've needed you and Nikki and the finance people be looking at the budget for next year. And I would think that this is a subject that what we should be saying to you guys as the finance committee, once this is in place and we've gotten all this done, so you have a little breathing room, we will appreciate your bringing back to us ideas and ways to handle this particular situation. But we recognize that for the next month and a half to 2 months, we need to focus on what we need to do in order to actually get next year's budget in place.
And I appreciate that, President Levin. I think what we would anticipate is just that we'd be able to develop in a similar fashion when we talk about the pension funds in a few minutes, some plans that tie to that funding effort too. So I would anticipate bringing something back to the Finance Committee on this.
Thank you. I think that's the way to go, and that we would appreciate the staff doing it in that way.
Yeah, this is Trustee Mulvaney. I'd like to make an unproductive comment, and that's just recognition of some frustration of this issue. This is something we've talked about for many years. I'm sure longer than I've been on the board, where we've talked about the need to get rid of this debt or manage it. And the conversation, as I recall it, often seems to be it's a non-issue, it's a right pocket, left pocket, and that the golf course, as soon as they're profitable, will be able to pay this off. Turns out we didn't understand the issue perhaps as deeply as we should have. So I just want to express some of that frustration. It seems like this is something we've talked about so many times. And I'm sorry that it's now in the position where it's creating some problems for us from a management perspective and the vision of the golf course.
Yeah, I would say, Peter, something that we haven't talked about a lot because it hasn't been something that needed the immediate attention. There were other things. Prior boards have at great length discussed and gone over this, and both the golf course and the village staff have acted and done what they were instructed to do by prior boards. And so we are just now in a situation where we're getting to be able to look at how we're going to finance the new clubhouse. And it was under those circumstances that the prior boards had said, we'll look at all this and do it. So I would explain that I think it's because it wasn't necessary to address it at the time, that it hasn't been thoroughly addressed. What's been tried to be addressed in recent times was again begin to get the board up to speed on what it's going to take to do the new clubhouse. And this is a piece of that puzzle. But you have to understand that staff has acted exactly as prior boards have asked them and instructed them that.
Yeah, let me respond to that. I'm not in any way blaming staff. I'm blaming not past boards, but at least the time that I've been on the board. I'm sure I've raised this at least a dozen times to just sort of question this item. And it's come up, I think, with this current board in the past, maybe not since COVID, but over the past several years. So no blame to staff. I think the blame is not foreseeing this issue at the board level.
And it's not foreseeing COVID that prevented the
Lots of excuses here, but nonetheless, this is a topic we've talked for a long time about resolving, and I just want to raise the point. Okay, that's all. No blame, no. Just like I said, an unproductive comment, but I think it should be acknowledged. That's all.
Trustee Mulvaney, I don't think it's an unproductive comment, and certainly, blame is not what you're trying to pass. I would only point out this is something we certainly are capable of coming up with solutions for the board on, and I don't believe that we are in a firestorm type situation where we have to rush to create a policy. I believe we do have some time to do this in a thoughtful way, and we will bring that back to you. But I appreciate your point. It's well taken, and we'll get something back to the board in short order.
I have one comment on this. As we look to see what we can do to maximize revenue for the golf course, I guess I was a little surprised by the very modest fee increases that we're seeing, particularly because golf has, the course has been so well utilized. And I'm just wondering if we really are maximizing for 2021 the potential fees that we could be charging.
Yes, the fees that we're up against, unfortunately, include membership fees that all of our surrounding competition offer. So Winnetka, Wilmette, Highland Park, and Northbrook, once they reopen with their $12 million renovation, they do offer a membership fee to their residents that brings their dollar per round down significantly lower than our daily rack rate. So we're up against that competition. If I could foresee the future and know that we would have the great demand that we had this year, perhaps I would change my mind. But we did quite a few augmentations to our rate structure this year without changing the actual rates, but changing the times that the discounted rates were available. So we were able to take advantage to a point of the great demand without going beyond what was agreed upon by the village board at last year's budget meeting on what our rates should be. So although it's only $1, when you look at it, you know, we're charging now $54 for weekend rates for walking. If you compare it to, say, a Winnetka membership, if they play enough, their dollar per round goes down to probably almost $30. So we're quite a bit higher in the overall scheme of things when we're looking at the rate structure.
Are there any other questions on the golf course? Okay, thank you very much, Stella.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on to the water fund, Director Mao.
Yes, the water fund's proposed calendar year 21 budget request includes a little more than $3.5 million in expenditures. And again, four general topics to talk through. First is personnel. We've got 6 full-time employees on the water distribution side in the water fund, and 6 on the water production side, and that's the water mains and the water plant operation, respectively. The calendar year budget proposes an increase in staffing level on the water production side of the ledger by 1 water plant operator. And the reason for this is we've enjoyed great stability and long tenure at the water plant for many years, but we've got several senior water plant operators that are eligible and potentially retiring even within the next calendar year. And so what we are proposing is an additional water plant operator position to allow us to transition in a new operator, preferably a newly licensed operator, to be trained on the job and be capable of filling that anticipated vacancy when at least the first of those senior water plant operators retires. The expertise and certification experience of water plant operators is very specialized. These are not people that are generally available. They're not surprisingly, our staff is very long tenured. That's very common in the water industry, and so there's not an abundance of experienced operators that are out there. Well, the track that we've recommended following is to hire a newly licensed operator and train them ourselves. Every plant is a little bit different, and so there's real advantages to that. So that's the change in staffing levels proposed. We don't think we're necessarily going to pay for 6 operators for 12 months of the calendar year. Not likely to be the case, but it gives us that succession planning opportunity that we think is important. On the capital side within the water fund, two projects. One is to finish up our smart meter installation, system-wide meter replacement. The balance of the core and main contract will carry over into the early part of calendar year 21. Those improvements are being paid for, as you know, through the 2020 alternate revenue bonds. And that project is progressing quite well. We expect to be done with that system-wide installation relatively early in 2021. The other project is at the capital project at the plant. These are replacement of pumps and motors, a project that we deferred here in the stub year. And we've increased that pricing a little bit because we're going to likely need a little more outside support for that project because of retirement of an operator anticipated. Those 2 pumps, those are pumps that are involved in both the low lift pumps that bring raw water into the plant, and then the high lift pumps that pump it and supply it out into the distribution system. Two critical components of the water production operation that these pumps have been identified before as no longer being capable of pumping at their rated capacity, and repair parts are a problem. And so we feel that the time has come for those. The strategic plan initiatives, training and professional development, there's a little over $5,000 in the water fund for training. A large part of that is for maintaining certification for our water operators, both on the operational side and the distribution side and at the plant. And then again, the implementation, once all our wholesale meter changeover is completed, then we begin the final implementation. And as we noted earlier, the correlation with our utility billing and starting to reap some of the benefit of that infrastructure replacement. And then lastly, to be looked at in calendar year 21 is a review of the management fee. And I would direct any questions on that to Director Larson or Manager Corrali. Are there any questions on the water fund?
Hey, David, I wonder if you've given much consideration to privatizing operations. I know that's a very sensitive topic, but is that an option that you've explored?
We have not very rigorously. I don't know what kind of a cost comparison we'd be looking at. Again, it's a 24/7 operation. I'd be surprised that we'd be able to contract it out for less than it costs us in-house. And we're also kind of at a crossroads as we work to deliver, hopefully later this year, our feasibility study that's underway with the village of Winnetka on what we might be able to pursue collectively, both in our distribution systems and potentially with our water plants, which are both of a similar vintage.
Trustee Mulvaney, I think you're muted.
Yeah.
Oh.
I was just commenting that there are, of course, some in Illinois privatized potable water systems. So there are examples out there to learn from without giving up the asset itself. Just potentially something to explore, but thanks for the explanation.
If I can, I'd only add, I think with respect to what Director Mao was mentioning with our ongoing analysis with Winnetka, what it certainly does not do is take options off the table. And I think as we continue to evaluate that study, prior studies relative to Highland Park and other concepts that have been reviewed prior to making any major decisions, I think keeping those options available is certainly in our interest, and so that's something we would do as part of all of this analysis. But just wanted to add that.
Any other questions on the water fund? Okay, we will move on to motor fuel tax fund. Director Mao.
All right, on my screen here, there we go. The motor fuel tax, or MFT fund, for calendar year 21 is a relatively small proposed expenditure. These were modifications to two of our interconnected traffic signal systems on Green Bay Road, interconnected with the railroad system. These were deferred here in the stub year for a couple of reasons, and we're bringing these back. We've got a little bit better pricing model. And these are safety improvements as recommended by the ICC, who is the regulatory authority for the grade crossing equipment. And these upgrades are included battery backups and interconnection upgrades, as noted at the two locations on Green Bay Road. And then I would note that that new in the stub year was notification from the state, positive news from the state, which was good. That we report a lot of negative news from the state, and that was the first year of the Rebuild Illinois Grant Program funds from IDOT dispersed using their standard MFT formula, and so we received the first of 3 years of funds projected to be nearly $575,000 that will be, and the village will be looking to use those funds to supplement existing motor fuel tax funds for maintenance, street resurfacing improvements, beginning in 2022. So with that, I'd answer any questions you may have on the motor fuel tax fund. Okay, moving on, the Capital Projects Fund. I'll kick this off, and then Director Larson can join me. This is the balance of the funds remaining from the Tudor Court Street and Streetscape Improvement Project. These were general obligation limited tax bonds issued in October of last year. The Tudor Court project will finish with a small balance, and this calendar year 21 budget proposes to $155,000, or the remaining balance of that, for the Downtown Gateway and Wayfinding project, signage improvements. That project has started this year. We expect to have the first phase of those signs installed probably within the next 4 weeks, and those are vehicular directional signs and public parking and bicycle directional signs, and three pole-mounted pedestrian informational kiosks, sign boxes. The second phase, which if you recall when Tesca presented this plan to us, was multi-phase. The second phase includes downtown entry and directional signs, destination signs, and an event sign at Green Bay Road, an upgrade of the event sign at Green Bay Road and Park Avenue.
Thank you, Director Mao. So as Director Mao mentioned, the entirety of this balance, this $155,000, is expected to be left over from the Tudor Court project, and is indicated as a funding source in terms of planned use of fund reserves. This was a concept that we started with last year's budget to clearly identify how these projects were being funded. From a funding standpoint, when we issue general obligation bonds or alternate revenue source bonds, we do indicate clearly on the official statement when we solicit bids for the bonds what these funds will be used for. These funds were specifically outlined for downtown street and streetscape improvements, so they are somewhat limited in which types of projects they can be used for, which is why we're recommending funding for the downtown gateway and wayfinding signage. Similar to the alternate revenue bond sale, the village did have very positive results in its limited tax bond sale. Also received a premium on those bonds, which is why we will have some money left over for this project. Director Mao and I are happy to answer any questions.
I would just add real quickly, the Tudor Court project, which has been waiting for some additional, some of the final finishing touches to be delivered due to some COVID-related delays, is finally those last components are finally being installed this week, and that project will close out hopefully in the next month or so, which again points to the availability of these resources and the limited potential use for them.
Thank you, Manager Corrali. Are there any other questions on the Capital Projects Fund? Okay, seeing none. Assistant Finance Director Joseph.
Yeah, the police pension budget includes 3.4 million in expenditures. Again, this is mainly attributable to the increase in pension benefits. The fire pensions fund includes 48,900 in expenditures for pension benefits to a surviving spouse who is the last remaining participant in this fund. Just to highlight for any residents who may be listening in, these funds are statutorily controlled and managed by 2 separate pension boards. And as we discussed earlier, the contributions for both these funds are determined by the village's actuary. So I'm happy to answer any questions on the pension funds at this time.
Denise, could you just clarify for the benefit of those listening, the contributions into the pension fund are split between, particularly the police pension fund, are split between the village as a significant funder, but also the individual participants, active participants?
Correct. So as Village Manager Corrali indicated, a portion of the pension funds are funded by the general fund, as well as the public safety officers contributing a percentage from their salary on an annual basis.
And just a note of clarification, the figures that are included in the budget and on the slide represent the village's portion. And the public safety officers contribute about 9.9% of their salary, which is set by statute. Okay.
So if there are no additional questions, this concludes our presentation on the operating departments and fund level request. I will turn it over to Director Larson to present the community investment program.
Okay, thank you. We're in the home stretch, almost there. Okay, so moving on to the community investment program. So just a quick summary. Again, this is at the back of the budget. It runs from pages 89 through 137. All of the details of all the individual projects as proposed are included in those pages. I'm, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through them individually, but certainly if you have questions, we're happy to answer those. On a holistic level, the plan as a whole, as we mentioned earlier, has about $51.7 million in proposed improvements. There is a corresponding financing plan that's proposed to fund these improvements. That includes both the usage of revenue bonds for any water-related projects, and then referendum bond issues in calendar year 2022, 25, and 28. There are some question marks here, and that's one of the things that we'd like to get some feedback from the board. So we'll get into that in just a moment. And then just a note at the bottom of this summary of the CIP, we've also included placeholders for the golf clubhouse project, the water treatment plant upgrade / replacement, whatever the future of that service will be, and then the potential for the public works garage relocation. So again, there has not been funding allocated, but they're included in the plan just so we don't lose sight of those items. Okay, starting with some of the easier items, there's $855,000 is proposed in the water fund. Director Mal just went through the detail on those. And again, $155,000 in the downtown gateway signage project. Just the annotation here, again, these water meter replacements were funded with alternate revenue bonds, and the wayfinding signage was funded with limited tax bonds that were already, excuse me, already issued. Okay, moving on to the motor fuel tax fund. Again, we just went through these with the traffic signal controller modifications. There's about $55,000. Those three funds all have funding sources identified and paired with those projects. And then moving on to the Glencoe Golf Club Fund. At this point, I would ask Manager Nanos to give a little bit of detail on these items. We did go through them a little bit during her budget presentation, but there are $403,000 in capital improvements that were identified as meeting the threshold for our capital plan, which is typically above 20,000 or so. So at this point, I will turn it over to Manager Nanos to review these items.
Thank you. So the continuous golf cart pass, this is something that was approved last year. We did take the program down quite a bit due to COVID and did majority of the work in-house this year. And moving on to next year, we're going to tackle 4 more golf holes for $55,000. This does include a GPS portion for the golf cart, which would help us track them to keep them on the cart paths. As I mentioned before, the cart money that we receive for renting the electric carts is a big portion of our revenue, and being able to have those carts going even after a heavy rain event is crucial. So that's what the continuing cart path project is. The driving range T expansion and the protective safety driving range netted, I talked about a little bit earlier. These go hand in hand, and this is a project that is something that we can take on over the winter, something that can happen pretty quickly. As I discussed before, it is something that would impact the neighbors. It would have to be a public discussion on what we plan on doing. It's adjacent to Wesley Road, and the neighbors there would be impacted by a larger net, and we would plan on berming that area. We've already started some work with an architect to figure out how to camouflage the netting so it would actually be a benefit to the neighborhood and not the detriment. And this project is $325,000 for the netting, and we do estimate that, and this is a very low estimate, that over 5 years we would have a return on our investment, fully invested back into the golf club. And this would also help us with a new incremental revenue source to help pay back any funding for bond debt. Any questions on any of those projects? Thank you.
My apologies for my dog. Trying to find something else there. Thank you very much, Manager Nanos. Without any other questions on the golf club, we'll move on to the general fund. So this is really where the meat of the CIP is, and mostly where we need feedback from the committee. So we have identified for each of the projects in the general fund, we've identified a ranking and a timing. Understanding that many of these projects were deferred from the current year and moved over to the following year, the $2.1 million capital number is a little bit higher than what we would see normally. And what we've gone through and identified, again, the detailed descriptions are included in the actual budget document, is identified those items with a ranking of 1 that are very high priority. They're either equipment or projects that are used on a daily basis. They're workhorses in our public works and public safety departments. And then those items that are a priority ranking of 2 that are still important and need to be completed, but they could perhaps be completed at a later date or deferred for a period of time. Are there any specific questions on any of these projects?
The only thing I would add to sorry, Nikki, if I could add one thing real quick. Did I step on somebody? Was someone going to ask a question?
Nope, I was going to keep going, but you go ahead.
Yeah, no, the only thing I wanted to add relative to this is from a timeline standpoint, similar to some of my comments very early on in the presentation, there are some items here that waiting till the second half or the latter part of the first half and into the second half of the calendar year are possible. And the thinking behind that is, again, to perhaps preserve cash if that is a situation or a concern that we may have as we go into the fiscal year and as the year may progress, to be able to delay some of this. There are timeline issues with some of these pieces of equipment in particular. A sewer vac-all, for instance, can take sometimes 10 to 12 months for delivery once it's been ordered. And so being conscious of that is why some of those items are located as a higher priority from staff standpoint, and some are seen as perhaps something that we could wait till the second half of the year. So just to further clarify that point.
Thank you, Manager Corrali. And then if I could just add to that, at the bottom here, we have two items that are asterisked. That's the sidewalk tractor that is used in the village's sidewalk snowplow program, and the leaf vacuum replacement that would be used as part of the LEAF program. Because of the pilot programs and the additional analysis that are going into these two programs, we have ranked them at a little bit of a lower priority and a later time frame, because the replacement of these items would be ultimately dependent on the outcome of the additional analysis that would be done. And what I was trying to do earlier, and I'm going to try and do it again, hopefully without showing a picture of my dog, is we have the updated forecast. Are you able to see that spreadsheet? Okay, perfect. So this is the number that Trustee Rubin was indicating earlier. So if we're trying to reconcile the general fund budget, this is the financial forecast attachment for 2021. Total revenue of 19.1 million, total expenditures of 18.766. So that would be, the net operating budget is 377,000. So that would be the surplus without any capital included in the general fund. When we add these items that we've identified in the capital plan, you have about $2.1 million that would come out of the general fund. The reason why I wanted to show you this spreadsheet is we've projected out the other items in the capital program over the next 5 years for those items that we would propose to fund with general fund reserve. In doing that, we are also showing the projected fund balance that would be the result, assuming that all of our assumptions are sound here, through the year 2025. So with the capital plan as proposed, with these items funded out of cash reserves, we would end 2025 with approximately $3 million in the general fund balance. So that would be the long-term impact if we were to proceed with all of these projects through cash funding. Let me see if I can get back.
To just make a note based on that prior slide,
Let me go back to
one of the things that I'd like to just make sure everyone's aware of is when we think about what we want to have for our minimum fund balances, and of course we're fortunately materially above that right now. But if you think about what a minimum fund balance will be for us at the end of 2025, I'm pretty sure when you run the numbers, you'll find projected fund balance of $3,057,000. If you hit everything exactly, you were just omniscient. You're then below 2 months of operating expenses at that point. And so you're actually below the current policy. I'm not saying we do or don't do things. I just want to point out that that's what these projections forecast.
Thank you, Trustee Rubin. So going back to, and that's a good segue, actually. So going back to the draft budget as proposed. So the budget that was presented before you does include all of these items funded out of the general fund. Understanding that cash reserves is only one option for funding, we did want to present to the committee some alternatives in terms of moving forward. The obvious scenario here, if there are projects included in this list that you don't want to move forward with or you have questions about, obviously that's up to your ultimate approval. If you are amenable to moving forward to all of these items, with all of these items, there's a number of different financing options. So above and beyond cash reserves, we do have the ability to move forward with a referendum question. If we were to fund these items through bond financing, and I should point out that some of these items would be appropriate for bond financing, some of them would not. If you have a smaller equipment piece, that might not be appropriate for a long-term bond financing. Whereas if you were doing something like a residential sidewalk or an infrastructure project, that would be a little bit more appropriate from a bond financing standpoint. That being said, if we are going to issue bonds from a financial standpoint, it makes sense to aggregate as many capital projects as we can, that we can achieve or accomplish in a 3-year time frame together into one referendum request. So taking a look at what we have included in the CIP over a 10-year span, what would make sense from an aggregation standpoint, if the committee would like to consider a referendum question in spring of 2021, that dollar amount would be somewhere in the realm of $8 million to $10 million of capital projects bundled together. If we were to wait on that and defer that to spring of 2022, and bring forward a referendum question at that point in time, then the dollar amount would be more closer on the high end to $12 million. And this has to do with the fact that by shifting the bond timing, you're also picking up a few additional projects by shifting that forward. And there's also the potential for some of the costs of these projects to increase over time. We're already starting to see some upward pressure on our contractual supply capital projects in terms of pricing. So the further we go out, there is that potential for that price to increase. So those would be the two middle options. The last option is what the village board did with the Tudor Court option, and that would be to issue limited tax authority bonds. That does not require referendum approval. This has historically been a source of funding that the village viewed as an emergency source of funding if it was needed. We have about $3 million remaining in that authority. So understanding that there's about $2 million in projects, some of those items would not be appropriate for a bond issue that would take up a portion of that authority. So just looking at these 4 options, timing is of the essence, obviously, in terms of how quickly we'd like to approve the capital projects. Again, we've kind of taken a ranking on those to identify those items that are higher priority for us. One item that I would note, understanding that Thursday evening at the Committee of the Whole, there is going to be a scheduled discussion about the village's governance. Assuming not, I don't want to assume how that conversation will come about, but as a result of that conversation, if the committee or the village board ultimately decides to move forward with a home rule referendum, the timing of that is something to be considered in conjunction with the timing of a bond referendum. So if we're going to place something on the ballot, that's something that we have to think about holistically as we make decisions going forward. Are there any questions on any of these options? Or Manager Corrali, do you have any more commentary?
Yeah, I want to add just a couple of thoughts, and I don't want not to take away from anything that Director Larson said. You know, certainly nobody's asking for a commitment tonight on a specific plan, particularly with questions that are as significant as a potential referendum question. These have been anticipated in the CIP's financing plan for about a year and a half since we initiated our first financing plan as a part of the CIP. And if you look at page 91 in the budget, you can kind of see how Director Larson has broken apart some of these potential bond issuances over time. It's certainly an aspect that warrants discussion and will continue, I think, on Thursday night as we continue the dialogue about home rule and whether a referendum question on that subject is appropriate at this time or not. And I think the one level of urgency, if there is any urgency to that decision, is one way or another, if the board seeks to consider a referendum question for a bond issue, similar to the timeline for the potential for a home rule question, that decision has to be made by December, at the December village board meeting, to be on the April 21 ballot. So that's, I guess, from the urgency standpoint, I don't want to light a fire under anybody that we have to make a decision tonight by any means. That's not at all what we're saying. But there is, as we work through some of this, going to be some level of need to determine kind of next steps there. The only other point I'd make, and then I'll get out of the way, is, certainly from the standpoint of what we've presented tonight in the CIP, there are projects in there that the board may feel are important. I don't want to articulate that there are no other ways for us to go about continuing these projects that have been listed. We certainly, if there's a desire on the board's part to pay for these CIP items out of the general fund reserve, there may be ways for us to go back to the operating budget. I think that will be complicated to find additional resources in the operating budget, but I don't want to make it sound as though there are no other alternatives to you. Certainly that is a subject for discussion among the group. There are, again, this is a historic practice for us in terms of use of fund balance reserve for capital projects such as these. The real unknown that comes along with this in ways that are different than what we've dealt with in the past is what will 2021 look like from a revenue scenario standpoint? And so we realize, there's some assumptions that had to have been made in terms of developing the budget, some of which may turn out to be overly conservative. But that being said, based off of what we know right now, those revenue projections feel right. And we'll have to adjust and have the ability to do so even after the budget is approved. As you know, obviously the board made some decisions after the stub year budget was approved this year to delay and defer. So I just wanted to add that additional information, and then again, make staff available for any questions that you have.
I had a question in regard to thinking about those options that are up on the screen right now and making decisions about it. I mean, a lot of detail, a lot of very well written detail, very helpful, useful detail is in the packet that we got, and about 2021 and their relative priorities that we've just heard about. That said, that's a little over $2 million, whereas options, $8 to $10 million referendum question in the spring of 2021, and in terms of prioritize versus waiting till 22, et cetera, how do these fit together in terms of the other $8 million, et cetera, or 8 to 10? Is that any of that affect 2021 expenditures, or is that just everything going forward?
I'm going to see if I can bring up, haven't done really well with this, so hold on. Okay, here we go. Can everyone see this spreadsheet?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so this is in the budget and it's on page 91. So this is the summary. That's a great question, Trustee Rubin. So what we are funding here, and I think Manager Corrali was referring to this earlier, if we were to move forward with a referendum, what we've tried to do down here, so our total community investment program is outlined here from left to right. Here's your 10 years, and then here's each of the categories. So typically what we try to do is fund infrastructure improvements with, and sometimes vehicles, but usually infrastructure improvements with bonding. So what we've tried to do is cluster surrounding 3-year periods, because that's typically the time period that you have to spend bond proceeds once you issue. Cluster 3-year periods for general obligation bonds. So taking a look, there's obviously the detail of each of these projects is in the following pages. I won't go through that, but have also come down to the funding source for these projects below. So this first line item, general fund, would be items that would be funded with general fund reserves. This looks like this might be, oh, if you take, what's happening here?
I think your blue box, box is taking into account things that actually aren't included in the bond.
The blue box is limited tax bonds. That's the capital project. So what I'm trying to get to now is the 2.1 that's in the general fund. So $120,000 of capital projects is grant funded. That's the Safe Routes to School program. And then the remaining items that were included in that list are general fund cash reserves. So we just separated this out to indicate that there is a separate funding source. There's a grant fund that's coming with that. So this column or this row here is generally what would come out of general fund cash reserves. Then the second column, very similarly, this is what would come out of water fund, and so on, motor fuel tax, golf club fund. Then down here, what we've tried to identify is what's actually bond proceeds. So this 155 is leftover bond proceeds from the 2019 issue. And then if we take the next 3 years, if we were to go out for a referendum, you could aggregate and get about $8 million. It's 7.9 as it is today, understanding that these prices will not go down, they will go up. You're pretty much at 8 million. And then when you shift out, it's a little bit harder to show here, because if we were to delay to 2022, we would be pushing out and grabbing some of these projects from 2025. Understanding the plan as proposed, these items up here, they're color coded, and they're supposed to match up with what we've proposed in terms of general fund obligation, general obligation bond issues. So the blue area here would be the first referendum bond issue. The gray area here would be the next grouping, and so on. And then this like bluish gray area here would be what we've proposed. So if you were to issue either 2021, 2022, whatever that ends up being here, then we would issue or propose to issue again in 24 and 27. So this is again just with what we know today. These are the groupings of items that we would be funding. So again, that would be sanitary sewer, storm sewer, sidewalks, streets, street lights, the larger items in the capital projects. And then this final funding issue right here, again, the 750 is leftover alternate revenue bonds from the bonds that we issued this year. And then to fund additional infrastructure projects, This is water main, so we have a $3.2 million issue, or 3.5 in 2022. And then grouping water main again, this would be alternate revenue bonds, almost $10 million, issuing again in 25, and then outwards from there. Understanding that in 2026, the big jump up here, that would be the relocation of the water tank. So that's just a placeholder. There's no guarantee that it would happen in that year. But again, we just don't want to lose sight of these things.
And
Does that
again,
walk through help?
sorry, I'll
Nope,
let anybody
okay.
else before I ask my question. So then with that projection of funding source, which by the way that was very helpful, thank you.
Thank you.
With that projection of funding source for some of it, but again, assuming you are in fact, as we all know you are, omniscient, and we do all of these projects for all of these exact numbers in this time frame, then going back to 65 pages ago, we see that we still run our funds down net, even with this bond plan, to going, by 2025, we're below the red line in terms of our minimum funds on hand that we want to have. So again, I just want to point, now who knows what the future is going to bring, but I just want to point out that what's been proposed sort of is the minimums, if you will. So for example, to the extent that some of the $2 million of improvements that we would otherwise pay for out of general funds, or 1.6 the following, or 1.7 the following year, et cetera, are of a longer term capital nature, because I don't believe in funding, a 5-year vehicle with a 20-year bond. That's a terrible way to live, or pretend to live. I don't know to what extent, if it was, there's more long-term capital being spent, that we could bump the fund. If you're going to ask for 10 at these rates that are available today, might we ask for 11 and ease up the pressure in terms of the funds we have to address emergencies like this $200,000 broken pipe fix and other things that we might face? I'm just wondering in terms of how much wiggle room there are in the numbers in terms of what we might do.
And from that standpoint, I think the answer is there is quite a bit. We certainly do have significant infrastructure needs, and there is a trade-off in waiting. I think the village has found that in the past, but there is a benefit certainly to aggregating projects together to alleviate the impact on the general fund, and really financing those items, paying them back over time, over their useful life. You're kind of, from an accounting standpoint, it's the matching principle, right? You're matching that cost of that item over the useful life. There is certainly room to revisit these. There are some items that are tied to regulatory needs. I know the inflow and infiltration expenditures related to that does have a time frame, a relatively fixed time frame in which that needs to be completed. I don't know, Director Mao, if you have any other thoughts in terms of timing on some of these infrastructure improvements. But this is typically something that we evaluate and reprioritize every year based on the financial situation of the village.
Yeah, the only thing I would note is included in that next 3-year window are large maintenance, street resurfacing, and stormwater improvements that have been on deferral until we were ready.
Yeah, because that's, I mean, I was just, looking at it previously and looking at it again, and two giant numbers that jump out at you are how much, this is really sanitary sewer, storm sewer, streets. That's the bulk of it. And, that's something that's quite all mission critical.
And sidewalk, we, historically, that's when we've made end roads with sidewalk replacement, and upgrades is through bonding. We make very little progress, budgeting 100,000 out of the general fund for sidewalks.
A couple of things. The struggle with a CIP is it's not an absolute map. It is an estimate with certain assumptions made depending upon what we know right now. And to Nikki's point, it gets things move up or back for a number of factors and for a number of reasons. The village has historically gone to referendum for the types of projects that we're talking about, for larger scale resurfacing. Obviously, our most recent 3 bond issuances that have gone to referendum have been focused heavily on stormwater management. Now that many of our significant stormwater management projects have been completed, there still are some out there, as you can see in here. But we do have that continuing need to be investing in our street network and in our other infrastructure overall. And some of that moves up or down with prioritization. I think to Director Mao's point, one other area that we want to be able to avail ourselves of more are grant programs that are available for things like sidewalk and pathway improvements. That is an aspect of the Green Bay Trail engineering work that we have programmed in the 2021 budget in an effort to hopefully defray almost the entire cost of improvements at the Hazel Avenue crossing in partnership with the Park District on that through the use of grant funds. That's an aspect of this that we don't spend a lot of time talking about, and it's difficult to anticipate within a spending plan. But those are aspects of this as well. I think as we think about what the right way forward on some of this is, it's also priorities of the board. And as we look at it, certainly there are there's a lot of thought placed into why things are in this, and I will argue this is probably our CIP process has in the last several years grown significantly, and the total CIP has grown significantly because we're getting more of our infrastructure and more information about our infrastructure into this planning process. But reprioritization from the board is an aspect of this too. And as we look at what we think is the right way forward, dialogue over why that is the case is an important part of how we get to a funding plan as well. This again, Nikki's done a great job of creating a means of achieving a funding plan. If we carry it forward, we know some of this is going to change along the way. So just again, there's what we have this year, in priority 1 versus priority 2. You add all those priority 2 items up together, it's about $565,000 of that 2.1 million. So what we're looking at, in all of those ranks, is the bulk of our projects. Some of that 120,000 for safe routes to school, by the way, that is fully grant funded. That is going to require no resources from the village. Ultimately, it's reimbursement. But and that's where I'm speaking from the sidewalk standpoint. There are going to be those opportunities further into the future as well. But you know, to some degree, the real question about this, we have a fairly solid practice of utilizing fund balance for capital projects. I think really the question that and why we're spending so much time on it this year is, given the unknowns of next year, and the unknowns that COVID has kind of laid in our laps for this year, is it comfortable to anticipate some of this with the full understanding and awareness that as we move through CY21, the board may and staff with you make determinations that some of this is just not feasible or possible, given how things happen.
Bill, let me make a suggestion. I think one of the points right now is very important. We have a history of doing a lot out of our fund balance, but our problem is, I think Nikki has done a very good but very conservative projection of what our revenues are going to be. And a lot depends on what happens with sales tax, income tax, or a whole string of things. In the last few days, I've been through some very substantial reviews of the economy and where it's going and so on. And all of the major indicators in terms of projections or future industrial production, et cetera, are all in the green, all on the upside, indicating that between the end of this quarter and the middle of next year, we'll have continued growth and have substantial growth to a much stronger economy by the second half of next year, 2021. Now, there are things that could knock that off and make what Nikki projected be correct. There are things like if there were further shutdowns and the things got bad. But if things keep going the way they are now, we could do substantially better in revenues. If you look at the trend on sales taxes and what happened after July, which mirrors what these figures looked like when we were doing the economy. I was working with the economic people projecting the economy, that mirror what those should have looked like, what their figures were coming in, and they ended up looking like. So we could have substantially more cash in the general fund during the last 2 quarters of next year than we project right now. So I think one of the things we should be doing is saying to you, take these priorities, figure out what we can leave to make decisions on as we see where we're going during the first 2 quarters of 2021. And we may not decide, the board may come back to you and say, nope, we can't afford that because we don't have the fund balances, or we may have much higher fund balances and be able to finish that off out of the fund balances with a better looking position going forward into 2022. So I think the budget has to be in parts. In other words, we may have a bigger budget, but with an understanding like this one that we have here, with an understanding that there are many things we won't make the actual decision on whether to pull the trigger until we see where we are as we go into the second half of 2021.
Clearly, one hopes that we're being very conservative and that what you just said comes to pass, and that in fact we wind up with better results than we're looking at. But even you assume modestly better results, we're in a village, we're in a situation where we have a lot of very old infrastructure, and the things that are laid out on the CIP, and by the way, again, I know it's been said before, but it's worth mentioning again, all of this is very well thought out, very well presented in terms of being able to try to look ahead, not just a year, but out into the future and see what it is we need to try to plan for, knowing that every year we're going to fine tune that for the forecast going forward. But these infrastructure projects are extremely important. They're a lot of what makes, when people come here and they go, oh, do I want to move to Glencoe or Winnetka or wherever? One of the factors is, our infrastructure, no question about it. One of the factors in just the pleasantness or not pleasantness of living here are a lot of these things. I mean, it really does make a difference in how the place looks, feels, and everything else. And also undoubtedly the cost of services and operating expenses if you're not making your capital expenditures. So there are all sorts of trade-offs, but these things are very important, and that's acknowledged. I'm wondering though, if, you go back to page 23, for example, and there's a really nice chart about what we're already talking about and intending, especially with the water bonds built into it for the most part, but not, for example, what would that chart look like about debt service, which otherwise is about to be going down quite a bit as existing debt of the village gets paid off. And hopefully with these low interest rates trending, what we can get, so to speak, in the market for the same dollars of taxes that we're collecting for that debt service. I'm just wondering if you do start to talk about, say, an $8 million bond next year, what might you project that chart then starts to look like? So we know we know something about how that fits in, and puts in context, not just sort of the gross, hey, we're asking you all for permission to go spend this dollars. By the way, this is about what it's going to do to your individual personal tax bill. I think that kind of information would be helpful when we ultimately, obviously we're not making the decision now, but when we ultimately make the decision to factor some of these things in, if we do all this and if we're omniscient and things don't get better and all the rest of that good stuff, what does that look like longer term for our residents? And what does that then tell us in terms of, we may make the exact same decisions for 2021, but maybe we might start to think about different decisions or opportunities or other ways to address problems in the future, depending upon what the numbers start to look like. Again, I realize that's all sort of vague, et cetera, but when we're all dealing with best guesses, having as much detail of what those best guesses will mean in dollars and cents for our residents seems to me to help the board ultimately make the decisions of, does it feel it needs to cut somewhere, or does it feel like, no, at least for now, we can keep going forward on this basis. And we've allocated a certain amount of pain that we're incurring already, and we don't need to incur more, and we can still keep up with all the important things we need to do.
Thank you, Trustee Rubin. And I just brought up the graph to which I believe you're referring to from the financial forecast. And we can certainly update this for the committee with the debt financing plan as proposed. There are some alternate revenue bonds included in this chart that show what the village would be paying in total in terms of debt service payments, but this would not be what would hit the property tax levy, where residents would be paying that directly. So we could certainly show that with or without. In terms of this chart, we do have this navy blue line is kind of projecting out the trend of what the village's historic high was in terms of debt payments, and that's been adjusted by CPI over time just to show that trend level. And then that red line is just showing the existing trend. So we do certainly have some room here, obviously with higher needs in the immediate future, that increases that level. But we do have some room in the out years in that we could finance capital projects and structure bond issues such that you would avoid sharp increases in the property tax levy. So we could certainly update this chart with some alternatives and visually show the finance committee what that would look like.
I think one aspect, and to Nikki's point, you know, I think this is a updating this for the board's consideration, where you don't necessarily show those alternate revenue bonds in there, does better highlight, you know, what sort of a property tax impact there would be. There was a time where the village was a little bit more fastidious in seeking new debt as old debt was retired. We've been in a fairly long period now where we have not issued new referendum sourced debt. We have not gone to referendum since 2015. The last two bond issuances prior to 2015 took place on 3-year cycles. So in the same period of time since our last one, we went to referendum twice the last time. So I think it's an important thing for us to consider from the standpoint of what does that debt load look like? How does it impact the overall property tax bill? What does that mean for a resident who is who's paying? And that, at the end of the day, is part of what we generally have been very good at conveying once we've gotten to a question and sharing that information with the community. But I think, to your point, Trustee Rubin, getting that in front of you guys in November is an opportunity for further dialogue on this to understand what it means.
So I had one question, which I hope has a very quick answer. These are not mutually exclusive options, as I understand it. You could certainly do the first and the fourth.
Correct. These
Yeah.
are all independent.
Yep.
Mhm.
So what are we looking for now?
Nikki, why don't you advance to the next slide after this? Thanks. I think to some degree, you know, we've gotten answers to these questions already, at least in the initial draft here of what's been put together. I think generally there's consensus, at least based on lack of questions or comments on the fee and fine analysis as the staff's presented it. And if that's the case, we'll maintain it where it sits. Relative to the budget recommendations that have been made in the operating departments, it appears that there is consensus that, as proposed, we can continue it into the next round. I think with the CIP, what I'm hearing is you need a little bit more information, and you may consider a couple of different alternatives in terms of moving forward. And we can update that debt service plan that we have already. We can share that with you. I think for the moment, unless somebody has concerns about what we've included, particularly in that list of general fund capital items, we'll maintain it for the time being, realizing, of course, that there can still be discussion and changes made to that list between now and when the board considers for final approval the budget at the December board meeting. But I think we've got a little bit of work to do to bring you some additional information on that debt service plan. And we can certainly pull that information together for our next presentation, which would take place at the board meeting in November.
And just to be clear, while everyone needs to consider the specific items proposed that are in the proposal for the following, you know, for this coming year, and that therefore would be directly affected by this budget, which again, kudos for the information at the back of this book in terms of going through them and explaining them. You know, I personally didn't say, oh, why are we doing this or why are we doing that? That was not my reaction at all. They all looked like there were things that need to be done, are appropriate. Frankly, my thoughts are more looking forward to how do we pay for it, especially if one of the options that the board might want to pursue is a bond that gets issued next year. And what does that mean in terms of what's included in its dollar amount, including things that are in the back of the book here for 2021. That was more to the point, rather than to try to say I had any concerns about the specific capital items that you have prioritized as being, we really should try to do these this coming year if possible.
Thank you, Trustee Rubin. Unless there are any other questions on the CIP, just in terms of next steps, to Manager Corrali's point, it sounds like we have some homework to do in terms of items to bring back before you in November. But our plan to move forward with this is to bring the draft budget presentation before the full village board on that Thursday evening, along with the property tax public hearing, with the idea that in December, we'll be able to come to a final recommendation and approval of the calendar year 2021 budget and corresponding tax levy, budget ordinance, and appropriation ordinance. Are there any other questions?
Just remind me, when do we need to make up our minds on going to referendum for a bond?
Well, we're going to talk more about that on Thursday night, and actually some of this discussion tonight, I think, will advise that conversation. It's timing based off of the ballot and the election itself. For us, it would be at the December board meeting, a decision to place a question on that ballot would need to be made by then.
So are we going to talk about all of this again on Thursday? Is that?
Well, as we mentioned before, one of the things that we need to talk about relates to this, and that's our ongoing discussion of the village's governance structure, and that translates out into home rule, non-home rule. A similar question is kind of before us from that standpoint of if there's a referendum question, as there has at least been some initial interest from the village board, not final, in pursuing that. That decision has to be made by December. I think in light of the conversation tonight, there's value in dialoguing further. I don't want to promise something that Nikki's going to have to put together, but if we're able to look at some of those debt schedules in time for that Thursday discussion to tie into our conversation relative to home rule, I think that would be useful. And we may be able to pull that together for that conversation. They really are related to one another, at least somewhat.
And then the 2 million for 2021 that's in the budget now, we're not changing that regardless of our referendum decision or home rule.
At the moment, correct.
Any other questions? All right. And there is nothing else on the agenda, is there?
Not unless you want there to be.
No, I think we've had enough.
I just wanted to thank staff for putting together, I think, a very thorough presentation and a very thorough job of putting together the budget in the form that we got it tonight, so that we could grapple with and see all the issues. That to me represents a Herculean effort, and I just want everybody to know that I think on behalf of the Finance Committee and the trustees, I think we very much appreciate what you guys got done.
Very much so, including the textual descriptions and the policies and projects, as well as the presentation of the numbers, which can be anything from clear as day to a foreign language that you can't decipher. And you guys do an amazing job at putting this together. Kudos.
we're very well served by a very professional staff, and I'm particularly lucky that the department heads that we have are as good at what they do as they are. But you know, this is a long process that got shortened this year, and some complexity got added in. There was a little bit of franticism in part of this, but it's you know, we're marching down the right path. We've got some work to do, and we look forward to the continued conversation and discussion with the board. And thanks to all of you, because it's a lot of time on your part for one of the most important sets of policy discussions that you'll have every year. So we appreciate the feedback that you provide to us.
All right, on that note, motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
You can do all in favor. No voice vote needed.
Nope. Thanks, everybody.
All right.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
We'll
you.
see you all Thursday.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.